Every morning, Jill started the same way. Wake up at 7 o'clock, wash up, and make breakfast at 8:30, and then wake up her dad for work. After tasting the soup she had made today and making sure it was perfect, she continued with her plan. The heroine shouted at her dad to wake up because breakfast was ready, but there was no answer. Jill looked into his room and called him again. Apparently, he was sleeping too soundly to hear her. She walked over to the bed and gently touched his shoulder so that waking up wouldn't take him by surprise, but Dad still hadn't woken up. Then the girl began to literally shake him, because if he didn't wake up right now, he might be late for work. But in response, she only heard a moo. And then Jill screamed loudly across the room, so loudly that the lonely neighbor probably thought that he was now a dad too. June opened his eyes abruptly, not knowing what to expect as a terrifying scream filled his room. He sat up abruptly, looked around, sweat appeared on his forehead from such an unexpected awakening, and then he saw her. Jill stood in front of him, screaming to wake him up. And at that moment, he remembered that he had a daughter under contract for 2 months now. Seeing that June had woken up, she stopped screaming, smiled broadly, and said that breakfast was ready and it was high time for him to get up. 10 years ago, so-called faults appeared on the earth, which disturbed the peace and harmony. People did not know what to do with them and were terribly frightened, seeing first only the rift, and then what emerged from them. Monsters emerged from the rifts in huge numbers, and it was impossible to cope with them. At the same time, some people, regardless of gender and age, developed strange abilities. They began to be called hunters, who could track their abilities like in a computer game. Hunters stood up to protect the cities and began to control the rifts, exterminating monsters. Jun didn't have any special skills, so he had to study and look for a job suitable for an ordinary person. After graduating, he was able to get a job as a civil servant in the fault department and became the youngest in the department. He had no special talents, which negatively affected his work, where he constantly forgot about reports and was late. And only after a year of hard work he was able to get his first assignment at the fault. He was excited for his first mission and set out to find the rift that had appeared. However, here too, failure awaited Juna. On the way to the mission, he was hit by a truck, a bright light, a blow. The expectation of pain, but it did not follow. He opened his eyes and could not understand where he was. People who also did not expect him to appear here told him that he was in a world called Murim. The world in which he died a huge number of times experienced terrible pain and suffering. But after death, he was reborn again and everything started anew. Because after appearing in Murim, he acquired one ability, a pocket watch that, in the event of death, would return him to the previous day and allow him to repeat the scenario again. June kept coming back to achieve his goal, win and stay alive. He did this so many times that it seemed he no longer remembered who he was or what he was doing. With each rewind, he drew conclusions and became stronger. And finally, he became the strongest warrior in this world. He had no other equal. The inhabitants of the world of Murima nicknamed him Chanma, which meant heavenly devil. However, now Juna was only concerned with one question: how to get back. He became the strongest, so as a reward he was given the same sudden return to his reality, just as he once fell out of it. The hero woke up in the hospital, but he felt fine. He got up, got dressed, and left it, as if he had woken up at home. The doctors were shocked because he was the one who was hit by a truck yesterday and had to undergo a 5-hour operation. June understood that he had spent a lot of time in another world, did not remember his own at all, and a long adaptation awaited him. He looked at his status window. All his stats were maxed out. He was the best hunter for his world, and there was no need to return to his old job. The memories of Murim frightened him, because there was a sea of blood on his hands. Memories flashed in his head. He stopped trusting anyone. He doesn't even remember how many times he died and was reborn again. And in that same second, he realized that now he wanted to be normal, go to work and live a normal life. Having decided everything, June went to work at the city hall, went up to the right floor, went into the right room and said hello. Everyone who worked in the department turned around and froze in shock, looking at the door. Greg was the first to speak up, but all he could ask was if June was okay. To which June replied that he was completely fine, and nothing terrible had happened to him. Greg noticed that he, at the very least, spoke differently and became more confident, after which he noted that his body seemed to have become stronger, although before he looked like a fragile guy. It was as if he was assessing him from the bottom up, and when he reached his face, he realized that his height had changed a little. June thanked him for all the compliments Greg had given him, but gave no indication that anything had changed. He assured that even if he had changed in appearance, he was still the same June who worked with them in the department, after which he asked where his workplace was, since he was in shock after the accident and had memory problems. Greg, however, took the position that everything he was saying now made him even more suspicious. Olivia, who had been smiling at him until now, was sure it was June, only prettier. The boss wasn't satisfied with June and Olivia's words, so he brought out a fingerprint scanner. The moment of truth, June put his thumb to the scanner, put it on, and everyone froze. It didn't take a minute before the scanner reported that it was indeed June, a worker from the Rift department. Greg screamed that another test was needed, grabbed his hand and put his finger on the scanner, which once again confirmed his identity. The test continued over and over until the entire department became tired of listening to the scanner say the same thing over and over again. Greg stood his ground and said that he didn't understand how a person could change so much in just one day, but Olivia couldn't take her eyes off him. She didn't understand at all how height, build, and voice could change, but she really liked the new June. June's head was already starting to split from the endless discussions about his changes, so he asked again where his place was, but there was no answer, and the boss decided to send him home so that he could have a good rest. He didn't hear June's objections and only repeated that he was still on sick leave and that he would only allow him to return to work tomorrow. Greg grabbed him by the shoulders and offered to walk him to the exit, but June refused, since he could do it himself. And so he went home. But it was not so easy, because he had not been here for a long time. It took him a couple of hours to finally find his home. He had to climb up on foot because he didn't remember what floor he lived on, but he remembered what his front door looked like. The door was found, but the hardest part remained, remembering the code to open it. He entered code after code, relying on muscle memory, but all attempts were unsuccessful. He had to stop and think. The code should be familiar to him after all. He had entered it so often before that moment. Another unsuccessful attempt, when suddenly a female voice was heard from behind the door. He listened again. Maybe he really was so unwell that he was hearing voices, when suddenly the door lock clicked. The door opened, and behind it was a young girl whom he saw for the first time. But for some reason she called him her uncle. He was stunned, and the only thing he could do was ask who she was. He walked inside, expecting anything to come from a conversation with a stranger who for some reason ended up in his apartment. June and the girl sat on opposite sides of the table. Outwardly, he seemed calm, but inside he was torn apart because he didn't know what to do. He took another sip from his mug and finally began to repeat after her the story he had just heard. Her name was Jill, and she was the daughter of his brother's girlfriend. He sighed heavily and said the same thing again slowly, trying to wrap his head around it. Jill nodded happily. It seemed to her that since he started talking to her, everything would be fine. June continued to reconstruct the events. His brother's girlfriend died in an accident. She had nowhere to go, and he agreed to look after her. And that's why she knew the code to his apartment and came here today, which made Jill smile. After which he decided to clarify whether they had seen each other at least once before today. After this moment, the girl became confused and replied that this was their first meeting. He looked for any way to resolve the situation and asked if Jill had any other relatives. In response, she hesitated and said that her mother was an orphan, so she had no one else to rely on. June suddenly became distracted by a plate with some dish and asked her what it was. She suddenly gained new hope and began to animatedly explain that it was omuraisu, an omelet and rice, and she had prepared it for June to have a snack after work, when suddenly he interrupted her and informed her that he would not be able to receive her at his place. Unexpectedly for him, the girl became furious, jumped up and screamed that he had promised her. She handed him her phone, opened the correspondence with him, and showed him the messages confirming this. And now he had to tell his story because, until yesterday, he was in the hospital, got into an accident, and was discharged only today. And most importantly, he lost his memory, did not remember his brother or the girl he promised to help. He didn't know what to answer to her question about whether he was okay, since his body had fully recovered. But memory is very poor, which can cause difficulties in everyday life. He understood that it would be difficult for him to take care of anyone now, because it would take him some time to adapt. Jill froze, as if she didn't know what to say, but in reality she was quickly going through her thoughts in her head to somehow fix the situation. Suddenly, she screamed that she wanted to sign a contract and come to an agreement with June. He didn't understand what she was talking about, so he decided to clarify what kind of contract she wanted to sign, to which Jill asked him to become her father until she finished school. At that moment, he regretted asking this question because her proposal was crazy. Without wasting any time, she flew up to him, grabbed his hand and began to convince him that he had lost his memory. It would be difficult for him to adapt, and she could help. She grabbed his hand and kept saying that she would take on the cleaning, the washing, the cooking to help him. And in exchange, he will allow her to live with him until she finishes school, at least for 6 months, until she moves into a dormitory. Jun thought about it because this was indeed a good condition. No, even a very good condition. He spent a long time in the Middle Ages, in a completely different world, and it will take time to adapt to the modern world. She could always be asked about things he didn't know, asked for help, and it was really beneficial for both of them. He reached into his briefcase, began to pull out paper and pen, and informed Jill that he was ready to draw up the contract. She was shocked, because the plan seemed unsuccessful and now she couldn't believe her ears. Jun silently sat down at the table and began to write something. It seemed as if they were concluding a multi-million-dollar deal right now. He handed her a piece of paper with the rules that they both had to live by and asked her to tell him if anything was unclear or if anything needed to be corrected. The contract specified deadlines, obligations to provide Jill with all receipts and checks, account for expenses, and perform all household chores. June asked again if there was anything that Jill didn't understand or didn't agree with, to which she replied that she was fine with everything. There was one last step left for the contract to come into effect, and he handed her a pen. With tears in her eyes, she took the pen. It seemed like she was about to cry, but everything was exactly as she wanted. She bent over the papers, signed them, and said she would do everything in her power. And at that moment, a smile lit up her face. Everything was decided, and she decided to clarify whether she could call Jun her father. He agreed, and then went to his room, and Jill shouted after him to call her by her name and to be informal. June agreed to this too. Jill hugged the contract to herself and breathed a sigh of relief, because he was getting used to it so quickly and suddenly remembered that she had forgotten something. So she followed him. She started talking before she even looked into the room, but her speech was interrupted as soon as she saw the strong, pumped-up, naked body. Jill gasped instantly, but couldn't take her eyes off him, even though he was her father, but such an attractive father and only under contract. She only turned away when Jun pulled up his t-shirt and was able to look at her. He still didn't understand what just happened, so he decided to continue the conversation and asked what else she needed. Sweat appeared on her face and she frantically began to explain that there was no food in the refrigerator and they needed to go to the store. His sarcastic question about whether it was true was just for the sake of continuing the conversation, because he had already taken out his wallet. He took out his card, handed it to her, and informed her that she would now be paying with it. She finally turned to him, took the card, and was taken aback. Could he really trust her so quickly? Jill couldn't take responsibility so quickly, and a plan came into her head. Since he had lost his memory, he should go with her. Suddenly, he would start remembering something if he went to the local store. It actually seemed like a good idea. The familiar surroundings might help him, so June agreed to go along with her. The store was on the next street. They got there quickly. This time, it seems, was not enough for the main character to remember anything. They stopped at a vegetable stand, and she told him that she simply had to cook for him for a while. But June was constantly distracted by an advertisement about a discount on meat and kept repeating that. All he could do was agree. He thanked her and said that he agreed. It seemed that she was again happy that he agreed with her. Suddenly, some noise caught their attention. There was tension in the air, as if something was about to happen. He asked her in bewilderment what was going on, because from her face it seemed that she had already understood everything. At that very second, a portal appeared in the air right in front of them, and people began to run away from it in panic. Jill immediately took the gun out of her bag and was ready to meet whoever was about to come out of it. It was a rift. She didn't know what kind of monster would come out of it now, but she knew one thing. She needed to protect Jun, so she asked him to hide. A huge green creature with huge fangs emerged from the portal. And not only did it stink terribly from its mouth, but strange sounds were also escaping, similar to either growling or mooing. Everyone who was in the store began to run out of it in panic, screaming that a goblin had come into the store for milk. Jun stood rooted to the spot and simply watched what was happening. He knew what to do, but he had only promised himself today that he would live a normal life. Jill hadn't promised anyone anything, so she immediately pointed the gun at the goblin and pulled the trigger. A beam of light shot out from the cannon, and a small wind arose from the power of the shot. And so, the bullet reached its target. Jill hit the goblin right in the chest. The goblin felt the blow, looked down, growled questioningly, and saw a huge hole in his body. He fell flat on the floor. It seemed he wouldn't need any more food. The shop's visitors began to surround him. They realized that he had lost consciousness forever, and they exhaled joyfully. Fortunately, there was a hunter in the shop who protected them. Jill leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, and continued to hold the gun tightly in her hands. Noticing Jun, she quickly came to her senses, hid the weapon back in her bag, and began to scold him for simply standing still when he was in danger. Jun apologized and said he would be careful in the future. It seemed that was what she wanted to hear, and she calmed down. The police were already hanging over the goblin. He was alone. There were no casualties, and they headed towards Jill because this was the result of her actions. As he approached them, the policeman asked if they had dealt with the goblin. but his gaze was directed towards Jun. With a quick movement of his hand, he brought Jill out in front of him and informed the policeman that his daughter had dealt with the goblin. He was shocked. Because the girl was only about 14 years old, he couldn't believe that it was really her. But quickly getting his bearings, he asked for identification, phone number, address, and bank account information. There was a reward for killing a goblin. This was the price for destroying the goblin in Mana. The police will pay it for preserving the lives and safety of the residents. The policeman said that the father could also provide a bank account and the money could be transferred to him. And June thought about it. He thought for a moment and asked Jill to state her score. She was surprised by what he said. He quickly removed all questions and said that it would be fair, because it was she who killed the goblin. She blushed with joy and quickly dictated her number so as not to scream with joy. They returned home. Jill was cooking dinner, when suddenly the phone made a notification sound. She grabbed it and looking at the screen was clearly shocked by something. For destroying the rift and the goblin, she received 150,000 won from the Seoul police. June managed to read the message. She got a large sum for killing just one goblin. If it was paid so much, then there was no point in her living with him, he asked. She found his naivety endearing and began to explain that there had been a time rift in the sky and a monster had appeared. It was an accident and no one could guarantee that all monsters would be so light. Besides, only licensed hunters can enter the rift, and she is still an ordinary person. He interrupted her with a question about whether she knew the law of reason, and Jill's face was frozen in question. She asked again what this law meant, and he explained that everything that happens in life is a reaction of the subconscious to what we are trying to convince ourselves of. Thoughts are material, and what happened to her was her desire. She understood what he was getting at and told him that she was planning to enroll in the Hunter's Academy in March. Jill had not yet completed Hunter Rebirth, but she already knew how to use mana and had a temporary permit for the mana gun, so she always carried it with her. He praised him, because not everyone can become a hunter, which means that special abilities were embedded inside her. She smiled and told him that he should treat her well, because one day she would become very famous. In addition, she had already set the table full of food, gave instructions to eat everything and leave nothing, and wished them a pleasant appetite. After discussing her future, she realized that she didn't know what June did for a living and immediately asked the question. While wolfing down his dinner, he replied that he worked in the mayor's office as an ordinary civil servant. Jill was satisfied with his answer, as she was worried that his work might be dangerous. She handed him another plate of food, wished him bon appetit and good night. This eventful day had come to an end. The morning came too quickly, and now June was already approaching the City Hall building. There were still about 5 minutes left before the start of the working day. It seemed like time had stopped. The whole department was waiting to see if he would show up for work today. The door to the office swung open. He walked in as if nothing had happened and said hello. His colleagues instantly turned around at the sound of his voice. Without hiding his surprise, Greg asked how he was feeling and whether he would be able to work. It seemed like yesterday he wasn't here, and the checks had started all over again. He thanked him for his concern and assured everyone else that he was perfectly fine. The department head tried to remain calm, so he leaned back in his chair and asked June to contact him at any time if he was having trouble, after which he pointed his finger at a free seat and finally answered the question that was asked yesterday. His seat was there. As he sat down on the chair, the guy sitting next to him told him that if June didn't remember something, he could come to him. He hesitated, didn't know what to answer, just as he didn't know who this guy was, what his name was, and why he offered to help him. The stranger understood everything from his facial expression, so he immediately said that his name was Nate, and he was his direct superior, and Greg was in charge above him. He thanked Nate for introducing himself, for offering to help, and for providing clarity on what was going on in the department. Greg glanced at his watch and noted that the workday had already begun. It seemed like everyone was waiting for someone. Nate quickly reassured him and noted that the one they were waiting for was a very valuable hunter, so it was necessary to bring him up to speed, to which Greg sniped, asking if an F rank was valuable. It didn't matter because they were still waiting for the hunter, and none of them showed up. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a door swinging open and heavy breathing and turned around. A beautiful red-haired girl stood in the doorway, her head bowed. It seemed that everyone was waiting for her. She exhaled heavily again, raised her head and asked a question, the answer to which was obvious. Yes, she was late. But when he saw her, Greg started waving his arms and claiming that it was his fault and that he should have met her. Nate pointed at them and suggested that June go say hello, since this was their new hunter. A silent question hung on June's face. It seemed he didn't understand why a hunter had come to their department. The boss took him by the hand and pulled him along, explaining to him along the way what was happening. The department was engaged in searching for faults, and they usually went on missions with a hunter. Miss Kate will have to take charge of June and help him with his work. He said hello and began to study her with his eyes, when suddenly Nate announced that Kate was supposed to be his ward, but she won't be. They were both surprised by this fact and turned to Nate questioningly. Nate hesitated, sweat breaking out on his forehead, but he continued speaking. June is not in a condition to go on a mission right now, so Nate will take over this matter. The main character began to boil, because initially this was his job. Nate continued to stand his ground. It was better for him to complete this task because no one knew what consequences the accident could have. Suddenly, Greg entered the conversation, stating that he was worried about whether June would be able to work normally. June didn't understand what was going on. Were they pretending that he was a dishonest employee? He stated that this was his job and he would be the one doing it. Nate began to panic even more and began to try to convince the protagonist that he should not overexert himself. Greg contributed to the general panic and started shouting about how June couldn't even find a job. June tried to remain calm, but there were explosions going on inside that were about to break out and hit the entire department. He took a deep breath and confidently stated once again that he would carry out his duties himself. Nate couldn't resist anymore. He knew that June needed this chance, a chance to prove that he was okay, and gave in. The shouts continued from the office for a while, and then everyone went to lunch. Greg and Nate sat outside and continued to discuss what had happened. One thinking that letting him go on the mission was crazy, the other trying to convince him otherwise. Jun was an employee of their department, and despite what happened, he had the right to another chance, because he never got to his first assignment. Thoughts were racing through Greg's head. He knew that there would be consequences to this decision, but whether good or bad, he didn't know. So, he gave in and agreed. June and Kate set out on their first mission. He was carefully studying the instructions, and the girl seemed to be waiting for him to finish. He folded the papers and decided that there was enough information to do everything right. After several readings, it was clear what needed to be done. It was his duty to study all the information about the rift, and support from the Hunter Academy was allocated to help him. As soon as he looked up from the paperwork, a girl's voice was heard from the back seat. She said that her name was Kate, and she was 21 years old. He apologized for such a long silence and said that he needed to check the documents. He turned around and his attention was drawn to what was lying on her lap. June asked what it was. Kate reported that her uniform and weapons, which were necessary for fighting monsters, were there. Suddenly, the car stopped, and the driver announced that they had arrived at the destination. They thanked him and left the car, June's face expressionless, and Kate pressed the button on the case and something clicked. The case opened and now one could see some strange greenish sphere inside it. The girl took it out and put it to her chest. June was perplexed by her actions. Suddenly, the sphere changed color and began to glow. At that very moment, the sphere completely covered Miss Kate's form, and it turned out that this was her costume. He couldn't take his eyes off either the fact that the little ball had dressed his partner on its own, or her curves. She became a little embarrassed and asked if this was the first time he'd seen this, to which June nodded affirmatively. Along the way, Kate told him that this suit was the lowest level of protection, but even it cost 3 million won, and her sword was far from the best. She stopped and asked what she should call him, to which he replied that he didn't care. Then she suggested calling him manager, since he was responsible for the faults. The security finished checking and they were finally able to move on. He agreed to her proposal. They walked along the stone path and finally saw the purpose of their visit. A huge glowing portal, a rift, inside of which there were probably a bunch of monsters. Kate's former confidence disappeared somewhere. She hesitated and said that this was the first time she was going into the rift alone. They were distracted by a rough male voice that was familiar to Kate. It was Michael and a couple of other hunters they used to work together. It seems his main goal was to hook Kate. He stated that he thought she was no longer a hunter. However, this was not the case. He looked at Jun carefully and asked if she had joined any guild, after which he leaned over her and made a sarcastic comment about how she didn't even know how to use mana. Kate lowered her head and her hair covered her face. She seemed to be on edge. Michael thought he had already won, but he couldn't stop and continued to put her down in the eyes of her new colleague. Just in case, June asked if Kate knew this big guy. She said that they once went to courses together to become hunters. Michael's attention was drawn to June's badge, and he began to study it. He burst out laughing when he learned that Kate was now working on a contract at the mayor's office. He wiped away his tears, quite amused by the fact that someone like her wouldn't be accepted into the guild, and since she was working under a contract, that meant she was still an F rank. June interrupted this madness by saying that everything he was doing now looked pathetic. Michael began to look to his comrades for support and point his finger at the one who defended the object of his ridicule. He looked down at him with disdain and called him an idiot. He grabbed his shirt collar and lifted it up, and Kate started screaming. Michael quietly hissed that if the civil servant didn't like something, then he should dare to stop him. Michael let out a scream, his face so close that the hair on June's head stood on end. He could no longer control himself. His eyes began to narrow with anger. It seemed as if they were filling with blood. Seeing this, Michael became frightened and widened his eyes but still did not let go of him. And in his head a terrible voice sounded, which said that if he let him go within 3 seconds, he would be forgiven. June's eyes grew redder and stared at the idiot who was slowly lowering him to the ground. Black smoke swirled around Michael as if waiting to attack him. He felt that he couldn't breathe and began to gasp for air. But no one saw it except Michael and June. One of his comrades shook him by the shoulder and asked if he was okay. At that very second, Michael fell to the ground and crawled away from something, covering his face with his hands. His friends were in a panic. From the outside, it looked like he had gone crazy. Suddenly, his pants got wet, and he was sitting right in front of the rift in a yellow puddle. Kate watched everything that was happening in surprise. She was glad that her offender was punished, but she did not understand at all what was happening here. June, satisfied with himself, grinned and decided to finish off Michael. He made a surprised face, extended his hand and asked if he was okay and could get up. But this was only a mask for the others. He leaned over to give him another message that only the two of them would hear. The devil's voice sounded in Michael's head again and told him not to interfere anymore if he valued his life. Michael burst into tears, bubbles coming out of his nose, and shouted that he agreed to everything. His team was in a panic. They didn't know what to do. And Kate covered her face with her hands. June flew past her and called her to follow him before something worse happened than what they had just seen. He jumped into the rift they had come to explore, but his partner did not follow him. He had to stick his hand through that hole to get her to finally pay attention to him. She followed him, and now they were on the other side. They looked around. This dimension didn't look like a monster's abode. On the contrary, there were mountains and forests all around, and the air seemed so fresh that they both took a deep breath. In the distance, they noticed a goblin wandering around the fields. Jun noted that this rift was F rank, which was probably why it looked so simple. He took out his tablet and began to enter data about the place where they had arrived. The computer informed that the F rank of the fault was selected. When setting a higher fault rank, it is worth choosing the exception item. After which, the mapping of the area began, which meant that Jun had nothing else to do at the moment. He put the tablet in his bag and slowly walked towards the goblin. Kate overtook him, shouting that she should go first. Even though she was here at the level of a porter, she should be responsible for the safety of ordinary people. Besides, if she shows herself to the manager from a good side, she will certainly be hired for a permanent job at the mayor's office. Their attention was drawn to a noise coming from somewhere to the side, and they stopped. In the clearing not far from them lay at least 6 dead goblins, and next to them were 3 hunters who had cleared the area. Jun was shocked. There were so many hunters who came here before them. Kate fell to her knees and began to wail that she had to show at least something, prove what she was capable of. He tried to reassure her that since the goblins were gone, all they had to do was finish the map and the job would be done. June decided to check his partner's status and opened her card. He was surprised. Weren't her parameters those of an ordinary person? Suddenly, he was attracted by her skill. It was S-rank fencing. She said that at first she was quite pleased because there weren't many such S-rank skills. When she first started taking the courses, she was among the first, she continued. But with every word, her condition changed for the worse. She bit a strand of her fiery hair and said that everything went wrong when she had to demonstrate her skill at the course. But what could she do, since she had no mana? The partner screamed that she could only try. Mana should have appeared at the 3rd level, but she didn't even know how to move to the 2nd level. Suddenly, June grabbed her by the elbows and yelled, pulling her back. Right in the place where she had just been crying, something fell loudly. It was a huge mace, which, from a strong throw, stuck into the ground. She looked up to see 3 goblins moving towards them. June had to lift her up and encourage her so that she wouldn't even think about the fact that she might fail. He whispered in her ear that the battle was about to begin and it was time for her to come to her senses. He pushed her in the back so that she would finally take at least a step. Kate collected her thoughts, pulled herself together, and focused on the goblins. She rushed towards them, drawing her sword and ready to attack. She slipped under one of the clubs the goblin was aiming straight at her head. She pushed off the ground with ease with one hand, and with a precise movement she cut one of them right on the nose. The goblin grabbed his face, and Kate knew that this wound would not be enough. She pushed off the ground and bent her leg, preparing to deliver another blow. The next powerful blow to the goblin's head was delivered by her heel, but the goblin continued to stand on 2 legs, preparing to answer for what had been done to him. His eyes began to glare and he rushed towards her. But Kate was ready for this, jumped towards him, and with one swing of her sword cut off his head. The headless body crashed to the ground next to the other goblin. Breathing heavily, she stopped, and then finally realized what she had just done. She turned to the manager and joyfully shouted that she could kill the goblin. However, looking back, she saw that Jun had his head down on the tablet, and another goblin was rushing straight towards him. With his claws and fangs bared, he growled and prepared to attack. Jun knew what was happening. It wasn't for nothing that he was the best warrior. He stood and just waited for the moment. And as soon as the goblin approached him at full speed, he took a step to the side. Kate's eyes widened as the goblin ran towards the manager. She didn't know what to expect, but she certainly didn't expect this turn of events. The goblin fell to the ground and rolled because he had expected to pounce on the guy, but he did not expect that he would have time to move away. After a couple of rolls, he was faced with a fall into an abyss, on the edge of which June was waiting for him. Kate was shocked as she looked at him, but June continued to stand calmly in place and look at the tablet. He had to remind her that the battle was still ongoing and that she should focus on the enemy, not him. But neither she nor the enemy cared about each other at that moment. They looked at him, fascinated. The goblin came to his senses a little earlier than Kate, growled and swung his club, aiming at her head. At the last moment, she managed to put out her sword and defend herself from his blow. Their duel lasted for about 5 minutes, but there was no winner. They swung again and again, but the opponent managed to parry the blows. Hope began to fade in her partner's eyes. She was exhausted and ready to give up. June decided to intervene and asked if she was really that tired out by just 2 goblins. She answered hesitantly that she was still full of strength, and the enemy took advantage of her hesitation. He swung to hit her legs, but she managed to spread them in time. He extended his club towards her and continued to advance. It seemed as if this stupid creature was rejoicing at her mistakes. She was starting to get angry. Sweat was running down her face. She was tired of this endless struggle. She picked up speed and rushed towards the goblin, swinging her sword. But he managed to calculate her actions and met her with a blow from his stick. June got tired of watching this endless and fruitless carnage, so he decided to intervene. He sighed heavily and asked if fencing was really her main skill. It seemed to him that the basis was blocking the attack and delivering blows with the least expenditure of force. He suggested that she step back a little and catch her breath, since her sword was shaking due to breathing problems. She followed his instructions and began to put her condition in order. He continued his instructions. She should focus on the enemy, because he was also already at his limit. She looked at the goblin. He was breathing heavily, steam coming out of his mouth. He was truly at the limit of his strength. All she had to do was watch her opponent carefully and concentrate on attacking until she had a good chance. The best solution would be to gather all your strength and use a fast and powerful attack. While the goblin was gaining momentum, June clarified that the most important thing was the ability to take advantage of an extra movement from the enemy. Kate humbly waited for his instructions, and now the moment had come. It was time to show the essence of fencing. It seemed as if nothing existed around except her and the goblin. She was staring at him. The goblin swung his club, seeming to put all his strength into the blow, hoping it would be his last. His club was flying straight at her, when suddenly something went wrong. He froze, watching as his weapon plunged straight into the ground. The moment Kate put her sword to his throat, it became clear that she had found the goblin's mistake. With a quick, sharp movement, she cut off his head. The monster let out its death roar, and its scarlet blood spurted from its neck. She exhaled, even though she was exhausted from the fight, but she finally succeeded. She stood over the lifeless body of the goblin and managed to show all the charm of fencing. June praised her. Thanks to her, the exploration of the rift went smoothly and it was possible to return. But all Kate wanted now was to lie down and rest. He also informed her that she had captured as many as 17 goblins and that if she worked alone, she could earn a lot of money. To which Kate suddenly jumped up and told him that she was not doing this for the money. She wanted to become a member of some team. She decided that now was a good time to ask why June was hiding her power. He pretended not to understand what she was talking about and took a step towards the portal. Kate started to say that he was very good at fencing and remembered the goblin he had neutralized with just one step. But June had already dived into the portal. She crossed her arms over her chest, not realizing how many mysteries her manager was keeping. It was evening in Seoul, and the streets were filled with the noise of cars and people hurrying home. June did the same thing, returning home after his first day of work. But he had to slow down a little. It seemed like someone was following him. He stopped, grabbed his head, and immediately realized who it was. The hero told his pursuer that if he came out within 10 seconds, he would not be angry, and began the countdown. 10, 9, and immediately switched to 3 to speed up the process of exposure. Kate flew out from around the corner towards him. She lowered her head guiltily and stood in front of him, afraid to say anything. June asked why she was following him. She was still haunted by the question she had asked him before his hasty jump into the portal. She couldn't understand why he was hiding his power, or whether there was no power at all and it was pure coincidence. June again did not answer the question, only told her that since she had followed him all the way home, she should at least have dinner with him. They walked the rest of the way home in silence. Kate slowed down as she walked up the stairs. Suddenly, she stopped and said that she would rather go home. She felt uncomfortable visiting him so late. June asked her to be patient with him a little longer. It was time for dinner. She should have already cooked. She widened her eyes and asked who she was, why she should have cooked dinner already, and why he was bringing Kate with him. He said that his daughter lives with him. Kate expected to hear anything, but the fact that he had a daughter shocked her. June had already knocked on the door and asked not to say a word about work, since his daughter thought he was an ordinary civil servant. Thoughts were racing through Kate's head. Maybe he got married early. Maybe he just looked young. But most importantly, she felt uncomfortable showing up like that with him. The door swung open and a young girl flew out of it with a smile on her face. But the smile instantly disappeared from her face as soon as she saw that her father did not return home alone. Kate's world collapsed, and she was surprised by his daughter's appearance. Why was it so big? He was only 26 years old. Maybe it was his wife and she just called him father. All this simply could not happen. Jill asked June who he had brought with him, to which he coldly replied that it was his colleague. Kate confirmed this information stammeringly and trying to be as friendly as possible. But this information was not enough for the girl to let them in. June seemed to be amused by this awkward scene, but he still decided to check if they could go inside yet. Jill opened the doors and finally invited them inside. When they walked inside, Kate and June were struck by the fact that the apartment was literally sparkling with cleanliness. Jill broke the pause and in an angelic voice announced that they would soon be having dinner and that her colleague should drink tea and leave. But still, it was June's apartment and his rules. He said that he invited her to dinner so they would do it together. The daughter made the most displeased face possible, crossed her arms over her chest, but was forced to agree. Then June commented on her behavior, not understanding whether she was going through puberty, to which Jill gave a loud negative answer. It seemed to dawn on Kate at that moment that she was not his daughter, but who she was to him remained a mystery. Jill pouted and went off to prepare dinner, displeased. Kate continued to stare at her, trying to find an answer. The long silence dragged on. So after dinner, Kate decided to break it and thanked him for the very tasty soup, to which Jill replied with displeasure that she had bought it. Then the colleague began to look for at least something to thank the girl with, but she quickly rebuffed his compliments. Jill was tired of playing this game, so she decided to turn away, when suddenly something caught her attention. It was the glittering huntress's case that stood in their hallway. Kate gained hope and began to explain that it was made for transportation, but was made in Schwartz's workshop. Suddenly she realized her mistake and quickly covered her mouth with her hands. With horror in her eyes, she turned to Jun, who was clearing the table. In his head, he quickly calculated options that would be plausible enough for Jill to believe in them. But Jill had already begun to build a logical chain, and if Kate was a hunter, was her father an ordinary civil servant? Jun quickly got his bearings and said that his colleague had a part-time job, and if she was caught, she would face a fine. So there was no point in telling anyone else this information. Jill slammed her hand on the table and towered over Kate. The girl's eyes widened, her mouth opened, and she knew what to expect from this girl. Suddenly, Jill happily grabbed her hands and began to tell her that she also dreamed of becoming a huntress. She took out her application form and started shouting that she would soon be entering the Academy of Hunters, looking with delight at her father's colleague. Kate was embarrassed because she was only an F-rank hunter. It didn't matter to the girl, she had just found her idol and started asking her questions. She wondered what her father's colleague's style was, how she fought, close or long range, or maybe she even used magic and was a healer. The rest of the evening flew by quickly. June didn't even have to take part in the conversation, and now they went outside to see Kate off. The girl thanked them for the dinner. She had never dined so cheerfully. When she said goodbye, she said that she would be glad to have dinner like that again. However, Jill asked her with a smile not to come again. She smiled even more and said that she still didn't like her, and that the fact that she was a hunter didn't change that. Kate felt awkward again and started to turn around to go home as quickly as possible. The hypocrisy scene was interrupted by June, who coldly sent his daughter home and said that he would walk his partner to the subway. Jill realized that she couldn't argue with her father, smiled again and ran home. June and Kate walked slowly towards the subway through the evening streets of Seoul. The girl, as always, was eager to start a conversation, and she stated that Jill was not June's biological daughter. The hero hesitated. His breathing became ragged. He did not know what to answer her. To which she confidently replied that neither the age nor the fact that he had no ring or not a single family photo at home matched up. Moreover, they had different surnames. All these facts led to only one conclusion. She was not his biological daughter, and he had never been married. June was shocked that she had managed to learn all this while she was in a lively conversation with Jill. And then she asked an uncomfortable question about what kind of relationship he had with Jill, whether there was anything dangerous in it, to which June hastened to reassure her. There really was nothing dangerous between them. She was his niece, and his brother had problems, so he was raising her. Kate realized that she had been too excited about her investigation that she hadn't thought about what it might lead to. She calmed down and apologized for asking too many questions. Jun didn't care. The only thing he asked was not to talk about it at work. The rest of the journey to the metro was silent, and now they were there. June said goodbye and immediately went back. Kate watched him go and seemed to be conducting some kind of investigation in her head again. Suddenly, it dawned on her how she hadn't noticed this fact right away. June and his brother probably shared the same last name, but their niece and daughter did not. But by the time she realized this, June had already disappeared around the corner. There were still about 5 minutes left before the start of the working day, but there was already shouting in the office. Greg read the folder June had filled out with bewilderment and asked in bewilderment how he had managed to do it in one day. But June was only concerned about one thing. Were there any problems in the report? But the report was done just fine. It usually takes several months to compile such data. June simply could not do this report alone. Greg turned to Nate with disbelief. He was sure that it was he who helped his colleague, but he shook his head, after which Nate praised June and said that now he would have to catch up with him. June, satisfied with what he had done, leaned over a little and said, "Thank you." Suddenly, Kate appeared next to him and continued to praise Nate. He didn't understand what she was doing there since today was her day off, but everyone else was glad to see her. He was in no mood to continue talking to her, so he sat down on a chair and told her to do what she wanted, but there would be no overtime. But she persistently handed him some piece of paper. He began to study what was written but still did not understand what it was. Nate decided to help the employee and said that the girl gave him the schedule of exams for the qualification of a hunter. All hunters took this exam once a year. The hunter's level could be increased or decreased. The highest was considered to be rank S and the lowest rank F. There were a huge number of guilds all over the world, each of which was constantly looking for high-level hunters. It was during the period after passing the exam that transitions between guilds were most common. Nate whispered to June that the department head was very worried about this day. Greg was afraid that the hunter would switch to another guild if his level rose and they would have to look for a new employee again. But Kate had to pass the test anyway, and June had better go with her, after which Nate found out that she was performing in the first group in a week. June turned to Kate and asked if she would switch to another guild if she leveled up, to which she told him that she wanted to extend her contract at the mayor's office. June replied that he was not the one doing that. He noted that she should raise her level before the certification day, so that it would be more convenient for him to go on assignments, and she could get a salary increase, to which she sadly replied that she would still end up with an F rank. He turned silently to her and waited for her to give the reason for this conclusion. The certification of hunters was divided into several stages. First, the level was determined, statistics were measured, and a practical assessment was made. The final result depended on all of this. But the most important thing was the amount of mana. Hunters could become physically stronger with the help of the crystal. This was the acceptance of mana, but Kate could not use it. At that moment, Jun realized that she had no hope of getting a rank higher than E. He tried to encourage her, telling her that she needed to try, otherwise she would never know what she was capable of. Otherwise, June will also have to trample on the level of the F faults. These words struck Kate. He only had one hunter in his care, and her rank was tied to the level of rifts he could explore. Kate lowered her head sadly and began to think that if she found another hunter, she could move forward. He pretended to like the idea and suggested posting an ad looking for another hunter. Tears began to well up in her eyes when suddenly June said that she was his only hunter and asked her to follow him. After meandering through the corridors for a long time, they finally entered a large room, which used to be an office for working with old faults. Now it has been converted into a training hall for hunters, with dummies and all kinds of weapons. He knocked on one of the walls. It was built using special materials provided by the Hunter Academy. The walls were quite resistant to impacts. And then June started talking about Kate's lack of mana. He asked if she had tried physical strengthening. Of course she tried, but she couldn't get mana until she reached level 3. Tears came to her eyes again and she called herself a complete failure. Then he asked to show him the fencing skill, and Kate took out some notes from her bag. She handed him a thick notebook in which she wrote down all her observations about the fight. There were indeed a lot of notes. She noted various combat techniques, sources of the universe that gave energy, and how to use these sources. Kate told him that there were sketches of techniques at the end. He opened the last pages, thought about it, and tried to make out at least something among her drawings. She apologized for her drawing skills, but it didn't matter, he realized. What she was drawing was similar to the three-way method. Kate was puzzled. All this time she thought she was studying fencing. June interrupted her thoughts and said that fencing was developed based on the three-way method. Long ago, there lived a swordsman named Jin, a scholar of the Imperial Palace, who suddenly appeared and just as suddenly disappeared after conquering the world of Murim. He was a genius among geniuses who reinterpreted Samya's three-pronged method. Jin called his method the fencing method and, leaving his advice and teaching on technique, disappeared. Jun was very pleased with something. It seemed like there was a sincere smile on his face. A fire sparkled in his eyes as he turned his gaze to her. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her violently. Kate didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, he declared that it was hard to find someone as lucky as she was. She was very pleased with the words he was saying, but she did not understand why he was saying them. It was almost 6 o'clock on the clock. Only a couple of seconds left before the end of the working day. Greg watched the clock patiently, counting down in his head. Time seemed to stand still. There was no longer any patience to wait for their slow progress. And then, 3 more, 2, 1, a characteristic sound was heard in the office, and a smile stretched across the boss's face. He opened his mouth and wanted to invite June somewhere, but he had already stood up, said goodbye, and headed for the exit. His example was followed by Kate, who jumped up from her seat and flew out after him like a bullet. Greg didn't understand what was going on. For several days in a row, these two had been disappearing as soon as the clock struck 6 o'clock. Maybe there was something between them. Nate expressed his doubts that perhaps there really was something on Kate's part. They discussed how only a fool would not have guessed that she had feelings for her boss. Greg chuckled, because June didn't seem to suspect anything. June and Kate continued their training downstairs at this time. She raised the sword over her shoulder, masterfully wielding it. Jump, hit, change position, stop for a moment to catch your breath and start all over again. After another swift swing, she stopped, raising her sword behind her back. Suddenly, she experienced something she had never experienced before, as if an inexplicable force had appeared inside her. Together with June, they looked at her status window. Her level had increased to 3, which meant that she could finally use mana. He applauded her because she achieved this result in just a week, and Kate said that their meeting was the greatest success for her. The manager replied with a sly smile that he would take this into account when he renewed her contract. Her face was filled with happiness at that moment. It seemed as if she had achieved everything she wanted in an instant. Suddenly, she hesitated and said out loud that everything was as she thought. June didn't understand where she was going with this, and she immediately stated that she understood that he was hiding his power. He sighed heavily again. He was tired of these hints. He led an ordinary life. But she tried again and again to find out something new about him. He turned around on the spot and said that he was going home, and they would only see each other tomorrow at the Hunter's Academy. But she seemed satisfied with his answer. The next morning, they went to the Hunter's Academy, a tall silver building that could be seen from every corner of the city. There were crowds of hunters standing around the building, who, like Kate, were participating in the testing today. Kate was in this place for the second time. She took the hunter exam here, but after that she didn't even try her hand. June encouraged her, because she had trained so hard and could expect a good result. Suddenly, someone from the crowd began to shout that Gale had entered the hall. Another one supported his cry because Emily was there too. 2 stately hunters entered the hall. The crowd in front of them froze. The girl hunter asked permission to pass with a sweet smile. The male hunter was not talkative and looked menacingly at those around him. Jun looked after them in bewilderment. He didn't understand who it was and why everyone was looking at them like that. Kate explained that these were hunters from the Icarus Guild, some of the strongest hunters in the entire world. He looked at them and thought, they looked like ordinary hunters who were simply showing off their fame. June said that there was nothing special about them and that if they tried hard enough, in a year, Kate would be in their place. The crowd around him burst into laughter at what he had just said, and his partner's eyes widened in fear. She covered her face with her hands, blushed, and asked him not to say that again. Gale was clearly nervous, unnerved by the fact that they had to make a business out of a routine check of hunters. He had to constantly watch his face because there were a lot of cameras around. Emily tried to cheer him up and noted that it was still more interesting than going on missions and getting dirty in the blood of monsters. Besides, they say that some genius will surely appear this year. He didn't believe her words. Year after year, he heard this tale, and not once did it become true. Emily jumped up and ran forward. She couldn't let another guild get a good hunter. Gale followed her slowly. They really couldn't afford it. Kate's old friends were watching them. Michael rubbed his chin and confidently stated that they should only wait for his performance. A fire shone in his eyes. He was eagerly awaiting this in order to receive the coveted invitation to the guild. However, his partners were not so confident in him due to recent events and, just in case, checked whether he had taken a spare pair of pants with him. A pleasant young man in a blue suit entered the common room above and announced that the statistics would be counted right now and asked the hunters to enter in order. June finally suggested that Kate go ahead. He was starting to get tired of waiting. The hunters lined up, from which conversations could be heard every now and then that someone would definitely get into Icarus. Ahead, all that was visible were countless people and the golden light from the huge gates. The next hunter approached the evaluation device and began testing. The computer displayed his statistics on the screen and showed a C rank, and those around him began to rejoice. And at that very moment, the hunter was surrounded by guild managers who began offering him work. Some offered free weapons, others a free suit, and some offered double the deposit. It took some effort for Kate to push through the crowd to get to the appraiser. 30 minutes later, she finally returned to the manager. Her head down and breathing heavily, breaking through the hunters was already a difficult task. Suddenly, she looked at him happily and announced that she had received D rank. Strength 6, Agility 11, Power 8, Mana 10. The last stat pleased her the most because she raised it from 0 in just a week. Inside, he shared her joy, but outwardly he seemed calm and quietly congratulated her. It was time for them to move on to the battlefield where they would have to show their skills. From the top floor of the arena, they watched the C-rank hunter who was in the same rank rift. June told Kate to get ready because she was going to go next. She hesitated and decided to ask again if she really should try her hand at a C-rank rift since she had only just reached D. He once again answered affirmatively that he was able to cope with the rift of this level. The girl was nervous and did not understand where he got such confidence from. June just asked me to trust him and try. The speakers announced that access to the rift would now be opened for the third group of rank C. Kate shook before leaving, trying to leave all her excitement behind, and she confidently took a step forward. But as soon as she stepped into the arena, she saw how many people were looking at her right now, and she started to worry again. A familiar voice called her name from behind her, and horror froze on her face. It was Michael, and he asked her in confusion what she was doing there. She hesitated and only moaned in response, and he mocked her sarcastically. He came closer and closer and hung over her, repeating his question over and over again. When suddenly he started yelling at her, he didn't understand that she really believed in her own strength. He screamed furiously that she was crazy. Tears welled up in her eyes. She cringed and began to apologize to him. Michael grabbed his head. It was the first time he had seen a hunter of the lowest rank try to pass the sea rift. The hunters who were undergoing the test with them turned around and couldn't believe their ears. An F-rank hunter was in the arena with them. They noticed that she was wearing a low-level suit. She began to doubt herself. It seemed as if she had become an ant in this huge arena. Michael was at a loss for words. He did not understand what she was hoping for here, and he hypnotized her with contempt. Suddenly, his eyes filled with horror. He started spinning around and looking around to see if that creepy guy who had made him wet his pants last time was with her. June watched this picture. He hated Michael, who was really nothing. Suddenly, someone entered the room from which he was watching her. It was Gale, the same hunter from the Icarus Guild that all the hunters wanted to join. He slowly began to talk about how June worked at the mayor's office and that he had a young hunter, Kate, under his care. June wasn't surprised that he was so well informed, but he didn't understand where he was going with his speech. Gale moved slowly towards him and decided to get straight to the point. He said that the Icarus Guild wanted to invite Kate to join them. She had never undergone physical strengthening before, and this was the first time that an F-rank hunter could increase her mana so much. With the help of the F crystal, she increased her stats to 10. Moreover, he noted that there was no record that she strengthened herself after this. She had a monstrous talent. June was silent. He was thinking over his next words in his head, because now everything could be used against him. Gale continued to talk about how the Icarus Guild would give her wings. She would be able to gain vast experience and knowledge, and participate in raids on the most difficult rifts. He looked at June intently, and finally asked what he could offer her to counterbalance him. Jun lowered his head. What could he offer her except a raise in salary? Gale continued to press. He noted that she hadn't been training for that long, but for some reason June sent her to a C-rank rift even though she hadn't been in raids higher than D. He tried to read his mind. Did June really think she could handle this level? Behind the glass, the speakers sounded again, announcing that the rift had been activated and the test had begun. The doors began to rise slowly, and a voice announced that the orc warriors had to be destroyed within a certain amount of time. Huge green creatures with red eyes and huge fangs moved towards them. Michael cried out joyfully that it had finally begun and reached for his weapon. Kate was already armed and stood in place, assessing her opponents. There was also a battle going on outside the window. Gale assured Jun that only a hunter could raise a real hunter, so he should let her go. He was already close to him and began to doubt what June thought about her. Perhaps he was important to him, and it was he who wanted her to be near. Jun began to scratch his neck, slowly trying to wrap his head around everything he had just been told. Finally, he declared that she was not a thing, and therefore he had no right to dispose of her. After which he smiled devilishly and offered Gale a bet. Gale listened to him attentively, but his face showed a question to which he was eagerly awaiting an answer. At that moment, a battle was raging in the arena, and the orcs were running towards the hunters as fast as they could. Michael stood close to Kate and asked her to finally pull herself together. They didn't have time to think. The orcs approached, emitting terrible growls. At that moment, Michael thought that it seemed like it was a mistake to decide on rank C. He froze and could not move as the huge green monster approached him. Then there was a powerful blow and the iron began to ring. Michael managed to put the weapon in front of himself at the last moment. He had a hard time resisting an orc that was at least twice his size. The orc pounded on his hammer. Michael began to lose ground. He could not do it anymore. His strength left him, and he lowered his weapon. At the same second, the orc delivered a powerful blow with his fist straight to the jaw. He flew away from him a couple of meters and the monster growled contentedly, feeling his superiority. Not only did he fly back from such a strong blow, his hammer also went in the opposite direction. He was defenseless at the moment when the club was already raised above him. He asked the monster to wait, which from the outside seemed simply ridiculous. Suddenly, Kate crashed right into his side and, at the very least, distracted the orc. She miscalculated his power, so she fell down next to him while he was still standing confidently on two legs. Michael watched in shock as it all happened. It seemed like he had just been saved by the girl he had been making fun of for a long time. She decided to finish off Michael's self-esteem and ordered him to step back and deal with the orc himself. He didn't understand what she was even talking about, how she could deal with an orc. But the enemy didn't care who he was fighting with. He let out a powerful roar and swung his club. He struck a precise blow, but Kate managed to jump back. This was the moment when she had the opportunity to figure out where he might go wrong. She watched his movements closely and finally understood his line of attack. Her eyes filled with confidence, and she knew what she needed to do next. As the orc prepared to strike, she quickly moved behind him. A couple of precise blows and the monster finally began to understand who he was dealing with. He had just started to turn around to look for her when she suddenly struck again. The orc's eyes widened in confusion. He didn't know how to deal with her. And Kate was already preparing for the next blow, doing a somersault right above him. She gripped her sword tightly and measured every movement. Her last blow hit the monster right in the back. It seemed to be fatal. Satisfied that she had not only defeated the orc, but had also used her swordsmanship skills, she froze in a victory pose. Everyone who watched this carnage behind the glass of the arena was in shock. The same thing was happening inside the arena. Those who just didn't understand what she was doing here realized that they were very wrong about her. The worst was for Michael, who constantly bullied her, and now it seems she saved him. June nodded in satisfaction. He knew she could handle this rift. Gale shouted that it was impossible, because just a week ago she was a hunter of the lowest rank. Jun turned to him with a grin and asked what he was so surprised about. He began to slowly say that there were only 3 ways to use mana. The first was to put mana into a weapon. The second method was the release of mana. And the third is the mana replacement technique. Putting mana into a weapon wasn't that difficult. But she just used the first and second techniques at once, and she did it quite skillfully. The voice from the speaker announced that the exam was over and asked to leave the examination room. The hunters encouraged each other. Only Michael still stood rooted to the spot. All he could do was ask how this was even possible. He looked up and saw on the scoreboard that he was at the very end, with a score of 0. Kate flew out of the exam room and rushed to June with words of gratitude. But on her way there appeared that very hunter, whom she looked at with admiration. He smiled and said it was a worthy fight. She became embarrassed and began to mumble that for him, an S-rank hunter, it would be quite simple. Gale noted that she was very skilled in fencing techniques and asked if she had a teacher. June intervened and coldly informed him that Kate was self-educating. She shook her head in panic, looking from Gale to her teacher, who denied this fact. She realized that June didn't want to talk about it. giggled, and confirmed his words. Gale interrupted her and addressed her by name. He decided to get straight to the point and invited her to join the Icarus Guild. If she agrees, she will be provided with everything she needs. He promised to give her everything she wants. But she interrupted him, thanked him for the offer, and said that she was not going to join his guild. Smiling, she turned to June. She couldn't just walk away from her teacher like that. Gale was furious, asking her to think about it, because such a chance doesn't come every day. She will be able to receive a salary several times higher than in the mayor's office. She will be able to develop. To which Kate apologized again and said that she was happy with everything as it was. The conversation was over. They turned around and together they walked away from the surprised hunter. Jun turned around and reminded him not to forget to call him. Thoughts were flying through Gale's head at the speed of light. He didn't understand why he had to call him. Suddenly, he remembered the bet they had made before Kate's fight. Right before the start, June declared that his ward would be able to destroy more than 5 orcs. And if June loses, he promises that he will persuade her to join the guild. But if he won, Gale owed him a Class A suit. At that moment, the bet seemed stupid to him. He was sure that he would win, so he happily agreed. The next day, their office was already filled with excited shouts from the morning. Kate took out her C-rank hunter card, but she was still shy. Greg and Nate complimented her because she had suddenly raised her rank from an F to a C. Nate took out his phone and asked if she was okay. They even published an article about her. He began to read out the headlines, which literally screamed that the Icarus Guild had been refused. This was a girl with an enviable talent. Who was she really? Nate was confused because Icarus was the best guild. To which Greg nudged him in the shoulder and reminded him that they were one of the best city halls. But he continued to lament that if he had been made this offer, he would not have refused. Greg didn't understand why he was doing this, because the huntress that all the guilds wanted to take away worked here, in the same office with them. Kate approached June and asked if he would treat her even better now. He nodded with a smile and said that she would not regret choosing to stay here. She smiled and was glad for his answer, because that was all she needed. Greg couldn't help but watch them and curl his fingers into a heart shape. June said that he and Kate would be going to Dahan's workshop, a place that was the largest store for hunting equipment. Nate tried to stop him, because their budget was not designed to buy equipment. Everything was already allocated, and for this they would have to consider an additional budget. Jun reassured him and informed him that they would not buy anything, but would only take what they had promised. And now they were already walking around the workshop, assessing the scale of this store. They walked further and further through the store, Kate waiting for them to finally stop. When June finally stopped, she realized that they were standing right now in the most expensive store in this workshop. They were greeted by the store manager. June said that he was from the Rift Affairs department and came from a hunter named Gale. She immediately understood what was being discussed, nodded affirmatively, and invited them into the store. She suggested that they look around and if they needed anything, they could immediately contact her. The first thing that caught their attention was the golden suit with the outline of a dragon. But it all seemed too much. They then moved on to a silver suit with red accents, with Kate saying she couldn't see a suit that suited her yet. She turned away from another display case to move on, when suddenly something caught her attention. A tight red suit with high black boots, and most importantly, fluttering white wings behind his back. Kate pressed herself against the display case, her breath catching. She knew that this costume was very good and was made from the wings of a queen ant. Jun looked at her like she was a little child and asked if she would take the suit. Her eyes were shining. She was dreaming about this suit. Something was breaking inside her. But out loud she said that it was very expensive. After 4 hours, Jun was exhausted. He didn't understand why they spent so much time here if in the end they still took the suit with wings. Joyful Kate didn't pay attention to him. What was more important to her now was that the suit also had a beautiful case. Jun's attention was drawn to a sign on a weapons crate that said everything in it was on sale at a 50% discount. He stopped and asked why all this was being sold at a discount, to which the seller replied that these were E-rank items, but that he could look for something worthwhile. The merchant said that if they took several items, he would increase the discount. One item cost only 1,000,000 won. Jun was shocked. How could they talk about a discount when the price was still very high? Kate tried to calm him down and said that all the hunting things cost that much. But he had already turned around and walked on. Such discounts did not interest him. Suddenly, something stopped him. Something flashed behind him, and he realized what was in that basket. He pounced on the basket like an animal on its prey and began to rummage through it. Kate watched this scene silently, not understanding what had just happened. Suddenly, June discovered what he was looking for and froze. In the basket lay a carved sword hilt that shimmered and emitted a red light. How could this thing be here? The sword of Chanma, his sword, the ruler of the world of Murim. He looked at the price tag, which said 50,000 won. The seller began to apologize. He didn't know how this stump got there and reached out to take it. June hugged it close to him, not intending to give it away. He asked if it was really only worth 50,000 won. The older man continued to apologize and said that this did not usually happen. June said rudely that he would buy this sword. The seller was perplexed. It was an old piece of iron. Only the handle was left. But the hero didn't care. He had already handed over the money. After the store, he went to Mount Umyan, where he watched the evening soul away from prying eyes. He clutched the handle he had just acquired. He was upset by the fact that the sword of the strongest warrior only cost 50,000 won. He swung it. The sword changed its glow to purple, and instead of a blade, black matter burst out of it. A wind rose around him, and the sword seemed to begin to fill the space around it. He made another swing, hid the blade, and remembered that his daughter was waiting for him at home, who had definitely already prepared dinner. The hero took out his phone and looked at the time. If he took the metro, it would be too late. He pushed off the ground, running was clearly faster, and now he was home. He opened the door and apologized for being so late, but no one was in a hurry to meet him. The TV was on, and the news reported that just recently, not far from Mount Umyan, a large-sized fault had appeared and immediately disappeared. But June wasn't listening to it. He looked into Jill's room, trying to understand why she hadn't met him. Jill leaned over the pile of documents, studying them carefully. Due to the move, she completely forgot about paying for equipment rental, lectures, maintenance costs, and several other items. She didn't understand why it was so expensive. It was a state university after all, and all the bills together came to more than 50 million won. Jill thought about telling her father about this, but it wasn't part of their contract. She should be grateful for the fact that he allowed her to live with him, but she was ashamed to ask for money for tuition. At that moment, her thoughts were interrupted by June, who entered the room. She was scared, because she missed him when he returned home. Frightened, she began to hide the papers from the table, but they didn't interest him. He came in to suggest having dinner together. She was flattered by the offer, but was forced to inform him that she was not hungry and suggested that he eat alone. He stood in the doorway and watched the strange picture. Jill began to build houses out of pencils right on the papers she had just been studying. The hero thought. It seemed that something was clearly wrong and a plan appeared in his head. He went into the kitchen and started shouting that he couldn't find any sesame oil. Jill didn't understand why he needed sesame oil at all, since she had already cooked dinner. She hurried to his kitchen to help him set the table without incident. The girl was distracted and he quietly crept into her room. He took the papers, quickly realized that these were bills and began to add up the amounts. 50 million won. He didn't have that kind of money. He was in a panic and didn't know what to do. After dinner, he could not fall asleep for a long time and lay in bed thinking. Suddenly, another thought flew into my head. If the entrance fee was such a huge sum, then how much would it cost for 3 years of study? He picked up his phone, opened the bank app, and there was a little more than 800,000 won in his account. June dialed Kate's number and decided to consult with her. But suddenly he realized that it was too late to call. Kate's voice came from the receiver, and she began asking him what had happened. He decided to go on the offensive and said that what had happened was that she was still not sleeping. In fact, Kate was already asleep, but when she saw that June was calling her, she simply couldn't ignore the call. He got down to business and asked how much an A-rank mana crystal that could be obtained by killing a monster cost. His eyes began to widen when the person on the other end of the line told him that one such crystal could fetch between 100 and 200 million. Kate thanked him for his concern but reminded him that she had only recently achieved C rank and was still far from A rank. He didn't understand what she was talking about, so he simply thanked her for her answer and said goodbye. But at that moment, a plan appeared in his head. The night flew by quickly. June quickly fell asleep, because in the morning he had to do what he had thought up. He put on a hooded sweatshirt, packed glasses, a mask and gloves in a backpack so that no one could recognize him, and took a fake hunter's pass. He read the note Jill left saying she was going to exercise, so he had about 3 hours. The hero went to Mount Guryong, where a rift had recently opened. He put on the protective gear he had brought with him. With a long leap, he jumped over the fences and signs that warned that the area was dangerous. And he quickly rushed to the place where the rift he needed was located. Jun looked at the rift and put the fake card on the rift entry machine. It was an A-rank rift. A voice from the machine warned that the rift was much higher than the hunter's rank. He didn't care that the rift was higher than the hunter's rank on the card, since he was a top-ranked hunter. The identity was confirmed, and there he was standing in a rift that strongly resembled the forest on Mount Umyong. His plan was to quickly destroy a couple of monsters, take their magic stones and go home, since today was a day off after all. Suddenly he heard the cracking of branches behind him. Someone else had entered this gap. These were 3 hunters who went on a mission to clear this rift. They were surprised that there was someone else in the rift. Jun rolled his eyes and realized that the situation had become a little more complicated now that it was known for sure that he was here. The hunter girl immediately called him crazy, because Jun was in an A-rank rift even without a suit. The hunters assumed that he was broadcasting a video from the rift. Such people often ended up in rifts. One of them headed towards Jun, and the other shouted after him to talk to the guy nicely and send him home. He walked up to Jun and introduced himself. His name was Alan, and he was a hunter of the Mizai Guild. Jun was silent. Because of the long silence, Alan began to get nervous and asked if it was really the hunter, because coming to this rift in such a video was a death sentence. Jun thanked him for his concern, said that he would kill a couple of monsters and leave, after which he announced that he was leaving, which caused a violent reaction from the hunters. Suddenly, they were distracted by a strong vibration from the ground. It seemed as if an earthquake had begun. Jun didn't understand what was happening, so he just stood there waiting. A glitch occurred in the rift and the Ogre King appeared. The exit from the rift was limited until the enemy was destroyed, or until all participants in the rift died. Alan shouted for his partner to press the emergency video recording button. At this moment, the president of the Hunter Academy, Adrian Chall, became tense due to a sudden glitch in one of the rifts. An assistant entered the office and reported that there were 3 hunters from the Mizai Guild and 1 F-rank hunter there. Adrian tensed up. How could a rank F hunter end up in the rift with them? The assistant said there was no sound on the emergency cameras, but the cameras showed that the hunters were on the trail and were about to destroy the monster. The Mizai Guild members are considered to be some of the best among A-rank hunters, and they are also well-armed, so they have a chance to cope, to which Adrian clarified what kind of boss was in the rift. The boss was the Ogre King. The president was tense, because most likely they would die, so he suggested going straight to the negotiation room. At this time, the hunters rushed along the rift. Alan ordered Mira to use the Hawk's Eye to find the monsters. Mira was a great long-range fighter. William was the most powerful healer he knew, and Alan himself had never lost. Having assessed the forces, he realized that there was a chance to win, especially if luck smiled on them, a little more than usual. His thoughts were interrupted by June, who said that they were not going the same way and that he would probably go. Alan suggested that he shut his mouth and stay close, and if he continued to talk nonsense, he would kill him himself. William caught up with Juna and apologized because Alan is generally a kind person, but right now he is very worried. Mira was worried about whether they would be able to survive, because the Ogre King was not an easy target even for S-rank hunters. Suddenly, Alan made a gesture for everyone to stop and stop their idiotic conversations. There was one dark ogre standing in front of them. They had to destroy it and move on. The captain turned to Mira and asked her to check if there were any other monsters nearby. Her eyes glowed a bright yellow, as if she had a computer in her head that was currently analyzing the area. Alan ordered Mira and William to cover him from behind, and he would take on those who were in front. After which he turned to June and told him not to act strangely and to stand there. They had already taken a step towards the ogres when Mira suddenly stopped them. The boys turned with questioning looks in their eyes, to which she responded that something was wrong. For some reason, all the ogres were moving in the same direction and she couldn't understand why. Suddenly it dawned on her why several monsters like robots were moving along a given trajectory. They were heading towards the Ogre King, who was apparently nearby. At this moment, Jun realized that even though there were 3 S-rank hunters next to him, the fight would not be easy. There were already more than 20 monsters gathered around the king, and they continued to accumulate. Jun assessed the team that was suddenly acting with him today and realized that with their abilities they wouldn't get very far. So he decided to take action, headed towards the ogres and sighed heavily. Alan grabbed him by the jacket and hurried to stop the suicide bomber. He asked him to stand there and not stick his head out, to which Jun mumbled something. Alan kept shouting that if everything failed because of him, he would personally strangle him before the ogre did it. But Jun begged him to listen to him. The hunter was seething. He no longer shouted, but sternly whispered for him to shut up or die right now. To which Jun lay down in the bushes, agreed with him, and told them to do what they wanted. Alan thought that since the ogres kept congregating in one place, they didn't have time to wait. The ogres needed to be taken one by one while there was such an opportunity, and then they would use Mira's sniper capabilities. And they began the fight, surrounding one of the monsters, which was at least twice their size. Alan swung his sword, preparing to deliver a powerful blow. Suddenly, his face was filled with horror. He certainly didn't expect the fight to start like this. The dark ogre intercepted the sword in flight and calmly held it in his huge hand. At that moment, Mira decided to distract the ogre and fired a barrage of arrows straight into his back. She stood confidently with her bow a little further away, while William shook next to her. The monster showered him with explosive arrows, and he turned towards them. William finally entered the fight and began firing his laser pistol, continuing to attract the ogre's attention. The huge machine was already moving towards them, so he asked Alan to speed up. Alan asked him not to show off and raised his huge sword, preparing to strike. With a swing, he struck the ogre just below the knees, cutting off his legs. The monster howled in pain, his eyes becoming bloodshot with anger. This was the perfect moment for Alan to deliver the finishing blow, and he wasn't going to let this opportunity pass. He plunged his sword into his back, black blood gushed from the wound, the ogre was dead. They dealt with this giant quickly. He took a couple of deep breaths to catch his breath and asked Mira where the next target was. She said that it was not far away, to which Alan suggested going right now so as not to waste time. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by William. He was looking towards the bushes where June should be waiting for them. But June wasn't there, he went somewhere, which means the hunters will have to look for this idiot. Not far from them, some kind of light show was taking place. Rays of light were darting in different directions. The culprit of the disco was June. After everything died down, he stood in the field with several dead ogres. He took the first twig he came across and began poking around in the ogres to get their crystals. June took another blue stone from the ogre and was pleased with his work. He put it in his briefcase and decided that this amount would be enough for him. But there was no way to go back. The exit from the rift was limited. It was necessary to catch the Ogre King as quickly as possible. He immediately remembered that Alan had promised to kill him if June did not obey. Therefore, I decided to lie down, rest, and let the hunters sweat. This is exactly what happened on the battlefield, Alan. Having climbed onto the ogre, tried to cut his throat with his sword. Mira fired a dozen arrows straight into his face. And finally, the ogre fell to the ground with a crash, pulling Alan down with him. Willia sat on the ground, his strength waning. Alan lay on top of the limp body, and the huntress said that these opponents were really tough. But the question still hung in my head as to why the monsters kept gathering together. They had only killed 11 monsters. Their strength was gone. They needed the Ogre King's mistake to win. While Alan was thinking, William called him from behind, his voice frightened. The hunter turned around and understood the reason for this fear. Right behind them stood a huge army of monsters led by the Ogre King. There was fear and indignation on his face. He did not understand when they all managed to gather. There was no time to prepare. We would have to fight in these conditions. Alan ordered to pull himself together. We had to be extremely careful, he suggested, slowly retreating back and catching them one by one. He began to outline his further plan, but hesitated. It seemed like this was the end. They had nothing more to do, they would die here, and suddenly there was an explosion. The ogres started the fight and struck, the force of which sent Willie flying into a tree. The Ogre King let out a loud cry, more like a growl, as if sending his fighters. Ogres were approaching Mira and Alan, and Mira thought that perhaps this morning was her most delicious and last breakfast. The team captain stepped in front of her, ordering her to run while he distracted the enemy and take William with her. But she didn't have the strength to do so. He decided to command even louder so that she would understand that at this moment he was not joking and was really ordering them to leave. After which he quickly rushed into battle, holding his long sword in front of him. It seemed that the ogres were even a little surprised by his courage, because he was going to fight alone against an entire army. Suddenly, light rays began flying around, cutting off the ogre's limbs. Alan couldn't understand what was happening because none of them had such skills. Mira, who had already lifted William onto her shoulder, was also in shock. It was the first time in their lives that they had seen something like this. June landed in front of Alan, blocking him from the battle. The captain asked what all this meant. June remained silent, assessing the situation. Suddenly, he created a greenish matter, creating a dome around the hunters and suggested that they not come out of there. It was a protective film. But was there anyone among them who could make protection of such huge dimensions? One of the ogres was already looming over June, aiming its blade straight at his head. As if mocking the monster, June also menacingly pointed at him the stick that he had recently been stripping from the twigs while lying on the grass. He threw his improvised weapon at it, when suddenly the ogre's body was torn into small pieces. William finally woke up and tried to comprehend where he was and what was happening, while Mira was shocked by the fact that the ogre exploded. The Ogre King was not going to give up so easily. June had only defeated one monster, but his army was huge. June took out his sword and decided that since he was here, he had to do everything to win. He continued to look at the army calmly and tossed the hilt of his sword as if playing with them, after which he powerfully threw the handle into the air and he finally sheathed the blade. At that very moment, in the place where the sword had just been, thunder began to rumble and lightning began to flash. The earth began to shake. Alan could not understand what kind of thunder it was and where it came from. William began to vomit, either from weakness or from injuries. Mira reported that this was not an ordinary thunder. His head began to split from pain. Alan closed his eyes. The thunder was getting louder. His eyes started to hurt. Vibrations were going through the ground, making it hard to stand on his feet. But this didn't bother Jun. He stood firmly in place and continued to control his abilities with a wave of his hand. The beams flew across the field again, cutting off limbs and making holes through the monsters. With each new action, this F-rank hunter was more and more amazing. Where he got his sword technique from was unclear. And so the rays caught up with the king of the ogres. All the power fell on him alone, as his army was completely destroyed. A pitiful cry escaped from his mouth. Blood flowed from everywhere. This was his defeat. Jun pulled the sword hilt back and caught it deftly. He covered the entire field with ogres and their king without taking a step from the spot. When suddenly a message came that the rift was returning to its normal state, it was finally possible to go home. Alan was finally able to get up, but he still couldn't figure out if the fight was really over or if he was seriously injured and dreaming it. He ran up to Jun and asked how he did all this, to which Jun suggested thinking that they killed the Ogre King. While putting the crystals into his backpack, he continued to talk about how it would be beneficial to their reputation and would also increase their value as hunters. It just didn't fit in his head. He had just destroyed a bunch of monsters, a boss, and was voluntarily giving them the laurels. Jun suggested doing it the way they wanted, but they still owed him for saving them, and these crystals would be enough for him. He quickly said goodbye, and a second later he was no longer visible. The hunters stared into space and couldn't understand why he just up and left. Alan said that they should have at least asked for a business card, to which Mira replied that he wouldn't come again anyway, since he was always swearing. The hunters in the academy watched the monitors in silence, as if the world around them had stopped. The two employees stared at the screen in amazement, not understanding how or what had happened there. President Adrian asked to play the recording again from the moment the ogres appeared. They reviewed the recording again. The appearance of the army, Alan ordering his partners to run, and Jun's phrase, with the instruction not to leave the dome. Adrian asked to stop at this point to understand something. He looked at Jun, who was throwing something that looked like a sword up and down over and over again. After zooming in on the screen, it became clear that it was not a sword, but just a hilt. This was followed by screams about some kind of thunder and pain in the head. One of the employees reported that the recordings from all cameras cut off at this point, to which Adrian asked his name. The employee replied that his name was Kim. The president grew nervous as he continued to extract information about this hunter. His colleagues told him that they had been unable to obtain any further information about the mysterious guy. The registration number, the address, and everything else was fake. Even the date of birth, the 99th day, the 99th month, the year 9909. He asked if there were any witnesses to how this guy came out of the rift, since several more hunters were sent there. He put 2 fingers to his temple, as if that would help him think better, but no answers came. In terms of skills, he is no less than S rank. He has the technique of transferring mana into a sword, and the protective film was the use of special skill. And as far as the president knew, there was no one among the hunters with such a style of techniques. He was sure that he would soon come out into the light. Jun was already home. He managed to return literally 10 minutes before Jill arrived and the door lock clicked. As if nothing had happened, he asked her where she went. She went into the kitchen, put her heavy bags on the table, and said that after sports, she stopped by the store for groceries. She turned to him and asked if he had had lunch. Jun said that he didn't want to have lunch, but while he had time, he would clean up his room. Entering the bedroom, he fell onto the bed, exhaled heavily, and decided that the room was already pretty clean. He had been on his feet since early morning, so he didn't want to do anything else. Suddenly, he sat down on the bed and reached for the bedside table. He opened the box where the magic stones he had obtained today lay. Jun thought that the workshop where he sold one of the magic stones might suspect something. Memories came to mind of how the girl who appraised the crystal said that after removing the commission it would be 250 million. But he only sold 1 small stone. Maybe everything will work out. He thought he would get much less for selling one, so now he simply had no idea what to do with the remaining 9. But his head hurt terribly. He didn't have the strength to think of anything now. He threw the crystals up. The pebbles scattered across the bed. He lay down with his arms and legs spread out in different directions. He clearly needed rest. The day flew by quickly. He slept through it all, restoring his strength. It was time for dinner. Unsuspectingly, Jill said that she had prepared a lot of different snacks, but if there was not enough, she would prepare more. Jun handed her the documents and invoices that had recently been worrying her. She looked down in disappointment and decided to ask the obvious question. Did he really look at them? But he was only interested in one thing. Why didn't she tell him anything? Jill thought he would hate her. She was grateful to him for letting June live here. And the bills needed 50 million? And she didn't want to cause him any trouble. June responded by crossing his arms over his chest. Yes. It was really stressful, and there was nothing mentioned in the contract about it. So it was necessary to urgently add this point. Jill's eyes widened. What was he even saying? At this point, June had already pulled out their contract and included a clause that obligated him to bear the costs associated with her education. He handed her the piece of paper and said that he would wait until Jill signed it. He was hungry, so he asked her to do it quickly. She looked at the document, not believing her eyes, which immediately filled with tears. Pleased with himself, he said that Dad was hungry and that she should sign quickly. She began to shed tears and thanked him through her sobs. June handed her a pack of napkins, joking along the way that his daughter was costing him a lot. They spent half the night trying to get Jill to stop saying thank you all the time, and then a new morning arrived and it was time to go to work. Everything seemed to be back to normal as he pulled on his coat to leave the house. He loudly announced that he was leaving, but Jill asked him to wait. She ran into him and began to straighten his tie, which had become twisted, after which she handed him a bag in which she had prepared a snack for him to take to work. Puzzled, he looked into the bag, thanked her, and said that it was definitely time to go. Her face beamed. She agreed with every word he said and wished her dad a good day. He went out into the corridor, the door slammed, the lock clicked, but it didn't move. June didn't understand. This is what the power of 50 million won looked like. The office was quiet. Nate was alone at work and listened to the news, thinking that the Mizai Guild was becoming more and more popular lately. The door opened and June walked into the office wishing him good morning. He asked if he had seen the news that said 3 A-rank hunters had destroyed the boss in the large rift. It was a dangerous question. He got nervous, started mumbling, and said that he didn't know anything. Nate wondered if the rift was a rank, and the boss was most likely S rank. How could 3 hunters handle it? This simply couldn't be. There was also a rank F hunter in the rift. Maybe he had something with him. He asked Jun if he thought the news was hiding something. June didn't think so and said that the Mezai Guild had always seemed like an honest organization to him. Nate agreed with him on this. This guild had never been involved in scandals. But then he wondered whether he had told June that it was the Mizai Guild or not. But, throwing these thoughts away, he suggested that Jun read about the big rifts, because his hunter was developing very quickly, and soon they would be able to go there on missions. Then he realized that their department had never had any hunters above rank B, so he himself didn't know how to prepare for such sorties. He handed him a folder. It was a file about a new fault that had appeared in a small province. On his last trip there, Nate dropped in briefly, and there were orcs there. It was supposedly a C-rank rift, and since Kate had received the same rank, it would be a good idea for them to go there. After which he said that it was an order from the head of the department, so he asked not to be offended. But June was not offended and on the contrary was pleased because this was a sign of trust. Nate praised him because June had been doing very well at work lately, and he offered him his help if he didn't understand something. June was grateful to him. At that moment, the red-haired fury, Kate, flew into the office apologizing for being late. Nate began to calm her down, because on normal days she could just stay at home. That was the rule in the department. Out of nowhere, Greg appeared next to Kate and began to scold him for not even being able to properly greet a valuable employee, as if she had no right to come here. He meekly greeted Kate and told her to come to the office at any time of the day or night. Realizing the comical nature of the situation, Kate laughed and thanked him. While the chaos was going on around them, June put on his coat, grabbed the folder Nate had given him, and asked him if he and Kate could go into the rift today. Nate started talking about how he only had to warn the bosses, and Greg immediately ordered them to leave immediately, and Kate jumped with joy behind his back. They had almost left the office when the boss's menacing voice came from behind them, demanding that they stop. He handed him 150,000 won and told Jun to make sure to treat the huntress so that she would be satisfied. The weather was just perfect. June and Kate had lunch together right in the area of the fault. Leaving the cafe, Kate thanked him for the lunch, and he said that it was all thanks to her. June noted that after she received C rank, the attitude of the mayor's office towards her changed. Kate didn't even notice it. She assumed that Greg could have celebrated June's successes in this way, but it was out of the question. 150,000 was a lot of money for the boss, and he clearly wanted to please her. The thought crossed his mind that this money was a drop in the ocean for him, with 200 million in his account. He pushed away unnecessary thoughts and suggested that Kate move on. The rift was not far away. They made a couple of turns, and right in the center of one of the streets there was a rift, around which there were quite a few hunters. Kate was surprised. Most likely a huge number of hunters already knew about this rift. Not far from the entrance there was a staff member of the Hunter Academy, as well as quite a few B-rank hunters. June asked again why there were B-rank hunters here, since the rift was lower in level for them. She said that it was common practice to hunt in the rift at a lower level for safety. Kate fell silent and began to look closely at what was happening near the rift. June asked if she was worried. The girl giggled nervously and said that she was really worried because this was the first rift on level C, after which she remembered the events in the first rift. She had to protect the manager and could no longer afford to make stupid mistakes. June seemed to read her mind and told her that she shouldn't worry about him because he wasn't fragile either. She puffed out her cheeks and said through her teeth that if he got into danger, he should just run. But the hero assured her that this would not happen. Her abilities were confirmed long before the certification. He also reminded that Kate had easily dealt with the orc, and that if she was careful, there would be no danger. June was sure of this and asked her to finally believe in herself. Kate was embarrassed, but agreed with him. He turned to the rift and noticed that the hunters were looking for partners, after which he remembered the hunters who were with him in the rift yesterday. They were a truly great team, but they all had terrible characters, as if they considered themselves superior to others. He was pulled out of his memories by Kate, who had already changed into her new scarlet tight-fitting suit with wings. June looked at her carefully. She started to get nervous and asked if this suit suited her. He said her name slowly. Sweat appeared on her face. She did not understand his reaction, after which he asked her if she could choose her partners. What type would she prefer? He began listing the types of warriors, such as a tank that distracts monsters or those who provide cover at long distances. Her lips began to twist into a displeased grimace. Was he ignoring her so openly? When he finally stopped thinking and looked at her, he was surprised and asked what was going on. She started screaming that he himself said that he had no one but her, or maybe it was a lie. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously and asked the most important question. Did the manager want to sign a contract with any other hunter? June stopped her, because even if he made a contract with another hunter, it didn't mean that the contract with her would be terminated. After this comment, her eyebrows hung heavily over her eyes, and she said that she didn't need anyone else. She turned around on the spot and walked importantly towards the vault, recommending that he follow her because they needed to work. Near the rift, there was a trainee from the Rift Control Department from the Hunter Academy who stuck one of his fingers deep into his nose. He threw aside what he had found during the excavations and noticed that something strange was happening here. 2 days have passed since the discovery of the rift, but the hunters who entered it still have not returned. The team that went there on the first day returned 8 hours later. After them, 32 hunters entered, but for some reason they did not return. Usually the hunt took exactly 8 hours, especially since there was no food or place to rest in this rift. He thought that this was definitely something to report to the Hunter Academy and began typing a message. But he immediately rejected this idea because there would soon be a change of post. Let someone else in charge deal with it. He was just an intern after all. A male voice addressed him, remarked on his good work and introduced itself. The man said his name was June and his partner was Kate, and they worked in the fault department at the mayor's office. The intern scratched his head and assumed that they had come to investigate the rift and handed him a tablet. While June was confirming his identity, the guy kept his eyes on Kate and finally realized something. This was the same huntress who refused the Icarus Guild. She looked down in embarrassment and confirmed his guess. She didn't like such popularity. June interrupted the awkward conversation and asked if they could come in, while already taking a step towards the rift. The intern extended his hands towards the rift, as if inviting them to come in. After which he told Kate that she was really popular, to which she asked him to stop. She was already ashamed. They stepped into the rift, and only then did the intern remember that he should have warned them about the peculiarities of this place. He watched their figures disappear into the portal and hoped that nothing bad would happen to them. June turned around and asked Kate if she had heard what he said, but she didn't seem to even hear the manager's question. The hero decided not to repeat the question and launched a program to scan the rift. The program reported that the fault had been registered and work could begin. June turned his gaze to the endless desert fields and suggested that they begin mapping the area. But Kate's attention was drawn to some people who were sitting not far from them. It looked like a hunter's camp, but they all looked tired. Several of them were writhing in pain. Some were sitting by the rocks, and some were already lying helplessly. Kate asked the manager what could have happened here. He suggested not to speculate and go ask them themselves. As they moved towards the hunters, one of them said that there were more sacrificial lambs in this place. Looking at Jun, the man noticed that he wasn't even a hunter and asked what business they had come here for. He introduced himself and said that they had come from the city hall, after which he asked the hunter to tell him about the situation inside the rift. There were a lot of wounded people around, but it was unclear why none of them came out. The man replied that the hunters were not just sitting there, they had no way to get out, and suggested that they turn around. The partners followed his suggestion, looking around them. When they suddenly noticed the rift, it seemed to have stopped. At first, Jun assumed it was a glitch, but then he realized that if it were him, it would be impossible to enter here. Then suddenly, Kate gave the answer to the riddle he couldn't solve. The rift was in a state of inhibition. She explained that glitches only occur in rifts above B rank, and slowdowns can occur in absolutely any rift. Fault stalling was a strange phenomenon that sometimes occurred as a feature of the fault. Kate approached the hunter and asked him to share all the information he knew about this place. He opened the information tablet, which spoke about the features of the rift, which was activated when more than 25 people were in it. And in order for the exit to open, it was necessary to destroy all the ordinary monsters. Kate carefully studied the information. In order to get out of here, you need to destroy 280 monsters. June noted that if you kill one of the champion monsters, you can get a B-rank weapon. The man coughed and suggested that they just wait here. They had been here for several days already, and soon they would surely send skilled hunters from the academy here. June objected, because if we combine our efforts, we can still destroy 280 monsters. The hunter chuckled in displeasure and asked if they even knew what kind of monsters were living here. Just like June, the wounded hunters thought that there were orcs here. His face filled with horror, and some memories surfaced in his head. June and Kate waited silently for him to continue. The hunter said that if they went a little further along the rift, they would meet B-rank trolls. Kate started to panic. She could still handle the orcs, but the trolls were already a new level. The man nodded. The trolls were indeed several times stronger than the orcs, which was why they were sitting here, waiting for help. Kate thought. It was impossible to kill the trolls with a few minor wounds. They could regenerate, so one powerful fatal blow was needed. But there was another problem. She was not sure that she could ensure the manager's safety. She told June that she would go the other way because it was too dangerous here. June only thought that now was one of the best opportunities to change her weapon, and an idea came into his head. He called Kate and asked if she was sure he was safe. Would she agree to go? This option was ideal. Then he turned his gaze behind her, as if indicating that she should turn around. June explained that he had found for her those who had not yet given up and would go to fight with them. The archer Ross, the tank Henry, and the healer Arthur. Ross was determined, so he said that if he initially thought that he had entered a B-rank rift, then there was no obstacle to hunting. Henry kept up with his partner, so he moved forward and offered to follow them, since they couldn't afford for a government employee to get hurt. When June caught up with him, he asked him what he was thinking when he came here without armor. June remained silent. Henry stared at him, waiting for an answer. He was talking to him. Why was there only silence in response? June continued to study the data. 3 trolls were waiting for them 30 meters ahead, so everyone should prepare for battle. While the hunter was trying to understand why he decided this, those same 3 monsters appeared behind him. The battle began, and June received information about the rift. It was indeed B rank, and the map's readiness level was currently less than 5%. Henry held out his shield with gold ornaments in front of him and was ready to begin. He rushed into battle, and the trolls seemed to be heading towards him. Kate was surprised. These were offensive skills. He was a powerful fighter. With his abilities, he pulled enemies towards himself, allowing the team to perform various maneuvers. As he continued to fight, he managed to shout out comments about how these opponents were not ordinary guys. Taking a small run, he powerfully hit one of the trolls, after which he performed a maneuver that allowed him to throw the monster over himself and separate it from the general crowd. He turned to the team and suggested that Ross deal with the one on the right first. He shouted in response that he already knew this and confidently pulled the arrow. A yellow target appeared near one of the trolls. It was the attacker's mark. It allowed to reduce the enemy's defense and increase the damage he would receive. Ross released an arrow and it pierced the blue giant's shoulder, causing him to growl in rage. He pulled the arrow out of himself and snapped it in half as if it were a straw. But Ross had no intention of retreating and immediately aimed a volley of arrows at the troll. Jokingly, he warned the troll that he was going to sting a little now, since he was planning to shoot 20 arrows at once. The troll lowered his head, either protecting his eyes or hiding them from the light emitted by the arrows. But this attack did not harm the troll. He only spent more time pulling the arrows out of himself. At this point, the situation became more complicated, because the archer assumed that after this attack the monster would be dead. As soon as the troll got rid of the thorns released at him, he rushed towards his offender. But Kate appeared in his path, ready to attack. She leapt high into the air, raising her sword to strike, the wings of her suit fluttering in the wind like her red hair. Kate was incredibly fast, so much so that the troll couldn't even figure out where she was at that moment. Suddenly, she struck a powerful blow, and the monster let out its death roar, losing its head at that moment. She exhaled heavily. She had spent a lot of energy on this attack. Ross was shouting behind her that they were a good match. Arthur, who was treating Henry at the time, asked the archer to think only about the battle now. Ross seethed. He didn't understand what he had just said, to which the healer replied that he didn't get involved in pointless arguments during a battle. At that moment, Kate approached June and asked if everything was okay. He, perplexed, replied that he was simply observing the battle and had no intention of interfering in it. The girl said that she was just worried about him and was glad that he was okay. June's face changed and he asked her to concentrate. And at that very moment, he ran away from the place where he had just been standing and shouted for Kate to turn around. A huge troll was flying at her from behind, intending to literally trample her into the ground. She managed to jump back at the last moment. The monster dug its claws into the ground. Henry apologized. It seemed like his skill had slipped out by mistake, putting her in danger. What had just happened was very dangerous. She began to think about what could have happened if the manager had come under attack. This could have been her fatal mistake, because he could have just died. This thought did not upset her. On the contrary, it gave her strength, and now she was ready to destroy everyone, just to protect her boss. She gripped the hilt of the sword tightly, as if the sword had grown to her hand. Kate rushed into battle. Now nothing could stop her. The troll opened his mouth wide. Even he seemed surprised by her confidence. She dealt him several cutting blows, but despite their force, it still looked graceful. The troll took several large leaps backwards to give himself room to maneuver. Watching the girl rushing towards him again, he made the only decision that was right for him. The monster let out a terrible, loud roar that seemed to vibrate the air around it. The hunters suddenly stopped, wondering what was happening to this troll. Henry begged everything around him that it wasn't what he thought it was. But he was not mistaken. It was a battle cry. The troll called the pack to his aid. A crowd of blue monsters rushed towards them, growling furiously and trying to destroy even the sand beneath them. The hunters turned and ran. It seemed like the only right way. Kate didn't move. She just watched as the deadly storm approached. 9 monsters were approaching her, but she had no intention of retreating. Ross noticed this. He didn't want to die, but he couldn't leave her there alone. He overtook his partners and asked them to stop. Kate needed help. They watched the girl as she confidently walked forward towards a whole horde of trolls. Arthur didn't understand what to do, but Henry removed all questions. They had to retreat. They would all die here. But Ross's attention was drawn to another detail. He saw her sword. The blade emitted a blue light and shimmered, as if it was filled with energy. This was the aura of the sword. June watched everything that was happening from hiding. He was confident in her abilities and tried not to give her any reason to worry about him. Henry shouted that it didn't matter what it was, the sword's aura or something else. You can't just stand there and wait for death. There were probably more monsters nearby. Ross didn't listen to him. Kate's behavior gave the archer confidence, and he was sure that they could handle it and ran. The ogres ran towards the battle, their claws and fangs bared. Kate assumed a fighting stance, preparing to strike first. And now they were close enough. She made a powerful dash and put the sword in front of her. Arthur and Henry thought she was crazy, but they still had to cover for her, so they followed Ross's example and headed towards the carnage. At this moment, at June's house, Jill was going through another ordinary day. She stocked the refrigerator with a variety of snacks, confident that her dad would like them. Stretching contentedly, she headed off to clean the apartment. She cleaned the living room, her room, washed and ironed all the clothes. Jill decided to clean her father's room as well, and she began to do the same as she did in the other rooms. Dust and vacuum. Suddenly, her attention was captured by a book with an unusual title, 50 Ways to Become a Good Father. Although there was nothing surprising about it, he had only recently learned to use hot water. Memory loss is a terrible thing. There was so much underlining in the book. She wanted to start reading, but something stopped her. Jill decided not to interfere in his business, grabbed the vacuum cleaner and decided it was time to continue cleaning. It was necessary to finish not only the cleaning, but also the school as soon as possible. Become a huntress and return everything to him 20 times more. After vacuuming, she noticed a garbage bag lying under the table. But when she pulled it towards herself, the contents seemed strange to her. It was too heavy to be garbage. She took out a magic stone from the bag. Did her father really throw it away? No, he definitely couldn't have done that. Maybe he accidentally fell out of the box. The crystal looked very expensive, but she decided not to think about it and put it back. She quickly opened the top drawer of his bedside table. The girl certainly didn't expect to see what was inside him, so she screamed in surprise. She lay on June's bed surrounded by magic stones. There were 9 of them. She wondered how much it all cost. No less interesting was the strange purple thing lying with them in the box. Maybe they should throw it away. And there was also a document in the drawer. A hunter's pass for a man whose name was unfamiliar to her. At this point, Kate continued to fight in the rift, swinging her sword over and over again. The next powerful blow was right on target, and she cut off the troll's arm. 2 more monsters were flying towards her, trying to attack her from above. But she was too fast for them, so when they struck, it hit the ground. She literally rolled on the ground and was ready to attack again. In one leap, she caught up with her opponent and struck him powerfully with her sword. There were already several troll corpses around her, but she continued to hit again and again. Things weren't going so smoothly for Ross. A huge blue hand was pinning him to the ground. He found the strength to move his hand away from his throat and screamed for help with all his might. Henry called him an idiot, but there was nothing he could do but help his comrade. He grabbed the troll from behind, muttering under his breath that he didn't understand why they were so strong at all. While the 3 guys were picking at one monster, she single-handedly killed another one. There was too little strength left. There were still 2 trolls ahead. But she couldn't afford to lose now. She had to protect the manager. Her eyes were bloodshot and she screamed that she would never give up. With loud cries, she flew back into battle and aimed the tip at the troll's head. But he managed to cover his head with his hands, defending himself from her blade. While one was resisting the sword, the other had the perfect opportunity to attack Kate. Her eyes widened. It seemed like the last attack had been a fatal mistake. The satisfied troll was already rushing towards her, preparing to destroy her. Suddenly he froze, as if he had turned to stone. The way the troll fell to the ground shocked both Kate and her opponent. Jun had to use his abilities, otherwise he would have returned from the rift without a partner. Kate took advantage of the opportunity to destroy another troll. Breathing heavily, she fell to her knees and tried to come to her senses. She thought about how incredibly lucky she had just been, but what was it? Jun stopped her thoughts by asking if she was okay. The girl smiled back and said that she was not hurt. Jun nodded in satisfaction but needed to take a break before moving on. With their combined efforts, the 3 hunters finally destroyed the troll as well and fell to the ground around it. 2 hours later, the air was again filled with the ringing of blades, exploding arrows and screams. Working together, they continued to exterminate the trolls in the rift. Henry checked the status window. In a couple of hours, they had destroyed over 100 monsters, and if they continued in the same spirit, they would be able to clear the rift. He looked at Kate. She had simply amazing abilities for a C-rank hunter. Was he really witnessing the birth of an S-rank hunter right now? Maybe that's why Ross never left her without his attention for a minute. At this point, the archer asked what she was doing after work and invited her to have dinner together. Kate hesitated and mumbled something about having things to do after work. Henry decided to intervene and suggested that they all have dinner together, since it was only thanks to her that they were still alive, a gesture that Ross did not like. Jun decided not to participate in these conversations and took out his tablet to check the state of the rift. They have already managed to open 60% of the map. If they continue to move as quickly, they will be able to finish today. Also, during this time, Kate has become even stronger. It looks like her mana has doubled. While she was doing her best to refuse the hunter's offers, Jun was thinking about how much her level and stats had increased. He decided to save Kate from the guys and suggested getting ready for battle, to which they suggested resting a little. But there was no time for this. 200 meters away, an enemy was waiting for them, who was much stronger than those they had destroyed before. At that moment, the ground began to vibrate, as if it wasn't a monster that was awaiting them, but an earthquake. The jolts became stronger, and now not only their legs were shaking, but they themselves seemed to be thrown up from the ground. And they saw the culprit of the earthquake, a huge purple troll with 3 heads. Arthur decided to check if the creature was a troll, but the answer was not needed. They needed to fight it anyway. Kate was exhausted, and at that moment she was looking for inner strength that would help her fight. But the monster was not going to give them any extra time. He roared terribly. Light balls began to form right next to the mouth of each head, and then one of the rays burst out of the troll's mouth and flew straight at Kate. She didn't expect such a quick attack and was so shocked that she simply froze in place. Jun understood only one thing, that this troll was too strong. His partner would not survive his attack. He rushed from his place towards her, and it didn't matter what would happen next because it was worth protecting her. Covering her with his body, he was ready to take this blow upon himself. There was an explosion. Sand rose into the air, and the shockwave threw Kate back. She fell to the ground and tried to disperse the dust that had risen from the impact. It was only after a few seconds that she realized what had happened. She stood up and started screaming Jun's name in a panic, trying to see him. Ross was lying on the ground and didn't understand what the hell happened. Was it just an explosion or someone got hit? Arthur, unlike him, already understood what happened. Henry pinned Arthur to the ground with force, ordering him to duck. One blow would be enough to kill him. Kate continued to run between blows, screaming June's name and begging him to answer. And finally she found him, but she didn't want to believe her eyes. June's body lay on the rocks, showing no signs of life. She approached him carefully and extended her hand, afraid to touch. Gently placing her hand on his shoulder, she asked him to wake up. Ross shouted that they needed to find somewhere to hide, hoping that the red-haired girl would hear him. Kate could only hear her own thoughts. She already realized that June was not breathing. Tears streamed from her eyes. She was unable to protect her boss. She threw herself into his arms and begged him to forgive her. But he could no longer answer her. Everything around was exploding, but she continued to hug June's body, not caring that she herself could die right now. Ross knew that if he didn't help her right now, it would all be over. He ran out of cover and headed towards her as fast as he could. Henry asked what the idiot was up to, and he asked him to go with him. The troll needed to reload for the next attack. They needed to get close to it. This was the only chance to defeat the monster. The hunters didn't want to admit it, but Ross was right, so they sped up and followed him. Henry shouted that he would attack from the front and ordered the boys to go around the monster on the right. He let out a battle cry and ran straight towards the monster, holding his mace out in front. Suddenly, the troll began charging the ball of light from its mouth again. Henry realized that the situation was not under their control. The monster attacked much faster than they expected. The monster fired a volley straight at the hunter, who flew away from him at high speed. After bouncing off the ground a couple of times, he finally stopped, his shield and mace flying to the side. Experiencing terrible pain, he could no longer continue the fight. Several hunters' marks appeared around the three-headed troll and flashed, blinding him. Ross stood close to him, launching a hail of arrows at him. With a sly smile, he told the troll that he was his opponent and should not be distracted, thereby trying to protect Kate. Memories flashed through Kate's mind. She saw their first meeting and acquaintance. The way he lifted her up in the first rift and asked her not to stand there like a pillar. They were in the middle of a battle after all. How he thanked her for new sensations and dishes that he had never tried. His smile and the phrase that she was the only hunter he needed. She thought she had finally found her place. Tears continued to roll down her cheeks. But suddenly, for some reason, a window of her status opened next to them. The window said that faced with circumstances, she acquired a new skill, an oath. Another explosion sounded behind her, and Ross barely managed to escape it. While the troll was reloading, he fired several more arrows straight at his head. The monster's eyes filled with anger. He opened his mouth and growled, spraying saliva in all directions. Ross kept up with his opponent and also shouted to show his determination. And then another volley of light burst from the troll's throat. At the last moment, the archer managed to dodge it, pressing himself to the ground. But right at his feet, two more explosions were heard, which sent the remaining two heads towards him. A powerful shockwave lifted him into the air and sent him flying. He fell flat on his back, raising a heap of sandy dust. Ross howled in pain as he fell right onto the rock. Henry was lying next to him. He suggested that he just die. Why was there any need to resist if he was whining from falling on a tiny stone? Arthur came running to him, asking if everything was okay with him, while the archer was tormented by the realization that he was a loser. At this moment, Kate continued reading. She had just received an S-rank skill that bound her with an oath to the target chosen by the master. Thanks to the oath, all of her stats doubled, and the damage she took was reduced as long as the chosen master was within a radius of 500 meters, after which a window popped up asking her to choose June as her master. Hope lit up her eyes, but she couldn't quite tell if that meant June was still alive. She wrapped her arms around him and prayed that it would work out. Suddenly, holographic bracelets appeared around their hands. The computer said that the gentleman had been selected and was within a radius of 500 meters. The oath's blessing was activated and her stats rose, ready to continue the fight. Henry also found the strength to get up, but it was difficult for him to attack alone, so he simply ran away from the explosions. The last one caught him. He fell and screamed at Ross to stop suffering and finally get up. The archer continued to lie there and asked to cover him a little longer. Arthur concluded that his partner had no conscience at all. Suddenly, Kate ran past them. She asked Arthur to look after him because he was still alive. Seeing her, Ross jumped up and shouted that he would cover her in battle. Henry looked at him with wide eyes. Literally a second ago, this idiot was lying there without strength. Because he reveled in his pain, he almost died several times. The next explosion landed right next to Henry and he was sent flying again. He fell right next to Arthur, who said that if they were to take damage immediately after he healed them, then there was simply no point in it. After which he asked me to wait here for a while he went and checked on Jun. Henry grabbed his hand and asked him to heal him first. Arthur had no choice but to agree. Jun finally came to his senses and was able to open his eyes. He saw that Kate had chosen him as her master. She has definitely become stronger, it seems, at least twice as strong. After which he thought that if he went out right now, it would be strange because he almost died. So he decided to sit in place for a little while longer. At this moment, Kate was moving decisively towards the huge troll. She teased him by zigzagging across the battlefield, daring him to attack. The troll got tired of playing by her rules and decided to act differently. The monster combined the efforts of all three heads, and a pillar of fire burst from its mouth. Kate didn't expect this. Dodging the fire, she jumped to the side, falling to the ground. She was in incredible pain. She clenched her fist and slammed it hard into the ground. Suddenly, she felt that she was in mortal danger. Turning around, Kate saw that right above her head was now the troll's huge right foot. Several explosions were heard behind the troll, and he winced in pain. It was Ross. He shouted to Kate that he would aim for his back and that she should not worry and just continue fighting. And then several explosions flew at him. He was no longer going to just fly and fall, so he began to use this to his advantage. The troll was distracted by Ross, which was the perfect moment for Kate to strike. She pushed off the ground and struck him straight in the shoulder, cutting his skin. The monster turned towards her with displeasure, grabbed the cut. It seemed that this was the first time he was really in pain. Without waiting for the attack to replenish, he decided to hit her right then and there with his whole arm, sending Kate flying. Landing expertly on her feet, she held her sword out in front of her to maintain her balance. At that moment, she realized that her damage had become much stronger and she would no longer yield to the troll in battle. Kate managed to fill her sword with aura again, and she rushed into battle. She gave him another punch to the shoulder and pushed off to land on the ground. While the monster was growling from the wound, she was already behind him. Without waiting for his answer, she dealt him several cutting blows straight into his back. With one hand, he tried to reach his back, where the last blows had landed, and with his eyes, he continued to search for the culprit of the pain. Finding her, he reached out to grab her and stop her from moving, but Kate dodged it expertly. Another blow hit the troll right in one of its three heads. He growled in pain again, and several fangs broke off and flew out of his mouth. The troll leaned on one knee, his strength seemingly running out. The monster missed another blow to the head, which Kate delivered to him with her foot. He fell on his back, screaming furiously, the air around him shaking, and Kate confidently walked around him. She looked him over again, as if choosing where to strike next. She jumped on his chest, and at that moment she realized that this was the end for him. Her sword glowed with blue light. She masterfully learned to use the sword's aura. She plunged the sword into his head and froze. The fight was over. Ross looked in fascination at the fragile girl who had just defeated a difficult boss. He exhaled and said that they barely made it. Henry noted that it was because of him that they almost died a couple of times. June watched her triumph from afar. She had grown incredibly, mastered the sword, but still had much to learn. He looked at himself. He knew one thing for sure. After work, he would have to buy new clothes, as they were all in huge holes. An image of Jill screaming because he was being bullied at work immediately came to mind. He finally stood up, took off his boot, and shook a mound of sand out of it. Arthur noticed this. He noted that June was absolutely fine. This comment was heard by Kate. Turning around, she saw the manager, who was alive. She rushed towards him faster than she had acted in battle, her eyes filling with tears. Kate ran into his arms and went limp, finally able to breathe out. Ross called June a bastard zombie. He didn't like coming back to life, which took away the girl's attention from him. Approaching June, Arthur asked how he managed to survive, but June was not sure of the answer to this question. Henry groaned and was sure that he would die today. He was overcome by the feeling as if 100 years of his life had been taken away from him. Arthur pointed his hands at Jun and said that he would still treat him, just in case. He was waving his arms strangely and panicking. Arthur asked him what he was doing. He was surprised. His abilities didn't work on Jun because there was nothing to heal in him. But how could this happen? He received direct fatal damage, but not only survived but was not wounded at all. Ross was still trying to deflect attention from him. What difference did it make? After all, he still survived. Henry suggested stopping here, because they no longer had the strength to fight and needed rest. June nodded in agreement. This was indeed the best option. The hunter asked how they should divide the magic cores they had obtained. The answer surprised him. June said that they should divide them equally among themselves. The law prevented him from making money from hunting, which Henry was glad of, but he was quick to point out that he had a pretty handy app for working with the rift. June asked the guys for a favor since he wasn't getting anything. They looked at him in surprise and waited for an answer as to what kind of service he needed from them. He pointed his finger towards the dead troll that lay not far from them. After killing the monster, an extra reward dropped, a B-rank sword, which he asked to give to Kate. They smiled and happily agreed to provide this service because they were able to deal with the troll only thanks to her. A pleased Kate held a brand new sword in her hands, her eyes sparkling with happiness. She couldn't stop thanking them. Ross noted that she looked very happy with her new weapon, and she laughed in response. Jun became wary when he heard footsteps approaching behind him. It was two hunters from the Icarus Guild who were walking towards them. Emily came closer and smiled and said hello. Gale continued to maintain a stern expression on his face. Gale responded with a sarcastic comment. He didn't expect to see June and Kate here, after which he turned to the carcass of the three-headed troll, which lay lifeless on the ground. He noted that Kate had become much stronger, and that she had dealt with the champion monster was amazing. She was pleased to hear such words from the famous hunter. She smiled sweetly and thanked him. Jun wasn't about to give in to the barbs, so he smirked and said it was all thanks to the suit Gale had given her. Gale began to slowly walk towards June, and for some reason reminded him that he had not given the suit as a gift, but had lost it. Emily intervened in the argument and suggested that Gale move on, as they still had a lot of work to do. Gale agreed and stated that he and Emily would go first since the others were so busy that they were just lounging, and headed ahead. Emily walked up to June, handed him a business card, and asked him to contact them if they were thinking about transferring. June asked what she meant, to which Emily replied that she was talking about transferring Kate to their guild. After these words, June began to slowly tear the business card he had just received into pieces. As he destroyed the business card in front of Emily, he said he didn't care if someone was treated like a thing to be bought or sold. At this moment, their comrades opened their mouths wide. Did he really tear the business card of the best guild to shreds? Jun continued that he didn't care about other people. Unless that someone was his person, then he wasn't going to hold back his comments. Emily froze. Cold sweat appeared on her face. It seemed like something went wrong, but she didn't mean anything bad. The hero clenched his teeth and hissed that this was the last warning and that he should not mention the word transfer in relation to Kate anymore. He continued to stare at Emily and said that talking about a person as if they were a thing was extremely offensive and threw the shreds of the business card on the ground. They returned from the rift late in the evening. The chief decided to organize a small corporate party in honor of today's outing. June decided not to go to it because Jill was waiting for him at home, and he had already spent time buying new clothes. On the other end of the line were cheerful drunk colleagues. He heard that right at that moment Kate was talking about the incident with the Icarus Guild. At that moment, Kate jumped up, waving her fists and trying to accurately convey June's words about how he would protect his man. Greg thanked June for his work and the right approach to their employee, while Nate jumped around in surprise in the background. Suddenly, Nate snatched the phone from his boss's hand and began to conduct his own dialogue with June. He noted that he thought tearing up the company's business card was too much. June asked for forgiveness for this act, when suddenly he heard approving notes from the end of the receiver. He decided to ask again what he meant, because so far the opinions were changing from phrase to phrase. Nate said he believes there are times to bow your head and times to let your anger out. The Icarus Guild was a huge and famous company, but that didn't mean they had to always lose to them, and yelled that June did the right thing. He kept shouting that it would be one thing if Kate left voluntarily, but treating her like a thing was disgusting. Greg joined the conversation, seeing nothing wrong with angering a couple of boastful S-rank hunters. Nate pulled the phone closer to himself and lowered his voice to a whisper, as if he wanted to ask something personal. He asked June if he could become his man too, so that he could be under the same confident protection.